Mr. Poole.
Mr. Gething, some questions then about asymptomatic transmission. And what I would like to do is start with some questions just to establish what you were told or what you were not told. And we start on the 28th of January 2020. It's a meeting between the former Secretary of State for Health, Mr. Hancock, and the CMO, and we've got it there. It's 302333747. If we could have a look at page 2 in the second bullet point, please. The CMO commented that today's data appears slightly less reassuring than yesterday's, but the positive is that there's been no sustained transmission outside of China. And then if we can go to the 9th bullet point, please, on that page, CMO commented that there is now credible evidence of asymptomatic transmission within Germany. Was that information that was brought to your attention at that point in time?
So what's the date of this?
This is the 28th of January.
No, the 20th of January, an asymptomatic transition in Germany.
Yep.
Okay, no.
If we could have a look, please, at the 4th. Actually, we don't need them to look at it. It's the 4th of February, so a few days after this. It's a SAGE meeting. There were no representatives from Wales. The minutes of that meeting note asymptomatic transmission cannot be ruled out, and transmission from mildly symptomatic individuals is likely. So do you recall in early February, that was a SAGE meeting on the 4th of February, do you recall being advised that asymptomatic transmission could not be ruled out at that stage?
Yeah, my recollection is that was the discussion. Asymptomatic couldn't be ruled out. It wasn't usual in the coronavirus, but actually the people who were symptomatic were likely to be infectious, yes. If
we move through to the 21st of February, there was a nerve tag meeting of that date. Again, I don't need the minutes pulled up. The minutes record John Edmonds reporting that 40% of virologically confirmed cases are asymptomatic. Again, were you made aware at that stage, this is 21st of February nerve tag meeting, that there was evidence of 40% of confirmed COVID cases being asymptomatic?
I can't remember the exact time, but I do recall that through February there was evidence that people could have COVID and not have symptoms, as opposed to be asymptomatic and be infectious as well. I think Dr. Orford went through the distinction with you as well.
And you would have recalled at the time there was the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, which showed very significant asymptomatic transmission. You were aware of that at around this time, 21st of February. Is that right?
No, I think the Diamond Princess, again, is the distinction between transmission and people who have COVID but don't have symptoms. So, yes, I think it was discussed in a COBRA meeting that the Diamond Princess, there were a number of people who had COVID but didn't have symptoms. And again, that's distinct from whether you can be infectious and give COVID to other people without symptoms. And that was a distinction where there still wasn't certainty about that at that point in time.
If we have a look, please, on the 15th of March, there is a paper published online. It's INQ 30312-305. If we can have a look at the abstract on page 2, we observed, so reading from the third line, we observed the highest viral load in the throat swabs at the time of symptomatic onset and inferred that infectiousness peaked on or before symptom onset. Estimated 44% of transmission could occur before first symptoms of the disease. Disease control measures should be adjusted to account for probably substantial pre-symptomatic transmission. Mr. Collins has provided, so that's evidence to the inquiry stating that so this is Brendan Collins, he is not in fact aware of a time when he thought that there was not any asymptomatic transmission. Were you aware of this paper and this 44% of transmission could occur before the first symptoms of the disease?
No, I wasn't aware of this paper at the time. We were aware, as I say, of the possibility of asymptomatic transmission without having confirmed evidence, or indeed about how likely transmission was from people who were asymptomatic as opposed to pre-symptomatic. So all of those distinctions and uncertainties were there.
If we have a look at a further paper, it's a paper, Centres for Disease Control and Prevention report. It's 27th of March. It's INQ 30224-063. So this CDC paper, it's a study that looked at asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic COVID-19 infections in residents of a long-term nursing facility. If we can have a look, please, at page 2, it's the box in the left-hand corner. what is already known. Once COVID is introduced into a long-term nursing facility, rapid transmission can occur. What is added by this report, we see that 76 of 82 residents were tested. Approximately half of those with a positive test were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic on the day of testing. And if we can have a look, if we can zoom out, but zoom into the right-hand column on this page, it's just under where we see discussion. It's about 5 lines down, starting approximately. Approximately half of all residents with positive test results did not have any symptoms at the time of testing, suggesting that transmission from asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic residents who were not recognised as having SARS-CoV-2 infection and therefore not isolated might have contributed to further spread. Similarly, studies have shown that influenza in the elderly, including those living in SNFs, often manifests as few or atypical symptoms, delaying diagnosis and contributing to transmission at 6 to 8. Then if we can just look 9 lines up from the bottom, that last paragraph there, although these findings do not quantify the relative contributions of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic residents, they suggest that these residents have the potential for substantial viral shedding. Low count values, which indicate large quantities of viral RNA, were identified for most of these residents, and there was no statistically significant difference in distribution of count values among the symptom status groups. Now, this is the report that Mr. Hancock described in his evidence to the inquiry in Module 2 as changing the scientific evidence that underpinned the policy advice in the UK. First question, were you aware of this report? So this is the 27th of March 2020.
Not on the 27th of March 2020, no. I think the document I have in front of me is dated the 3rd of April, but I recognise that the evidence was changing and firming up and moving around. That's the challenge in all of this as a decision maker. You've got evidence that something might happen without being clear about the extent to which it could happen. I think the World Health Organization issued a note on the 2nd of April saying that there was no evidence of asymptomatic transmission. Then the CDC, I think relying on this, it might be this report actually, then said that they think asymptomatic transmission is real and should be assumed. So, you're left with entirely different conclusions on the same subject, which is not helpful.
Now, the inquiry heard evidence from Mr. Hancock in Module 2 that he said his single greatest regret was not pushing harder for asymptomatic transmission to be the baseline assumption. Is that a regret that you share?
Again, my view is that that's a significant piece of hindsight that you then need to work through to understand what does that do in terms of changing how you deal with a novel virus. Because if you know from the outset asymptomatic transmission is a significant factor, you still then have to decide how do you test and identify people with COVID and how to then take effective infection prevention and control methods, or how big a group of the population do you assume have COVID, and the control measures themselves carry harm, of course. Isolation for people in care homes is not a benign intervention. So, that's part of the challenge in all of this. I don't think it's quite as simple as that's your single biggest regret. I think actually, if you have greater testing capacity, you can do a great deal more. And the place we ended up at the end of April into May could have been a real option if we'd had capacity and tests and the knowledge on asymptomatic transmission at the same time. So I don't think the puzzle is as simple as asymptomatic transmission and knowledge of that is the only thing you need to be aware of.
On the 16th of April, England introduced mandatory testing of all patients prior to discharge to a care home. We know that a day later, so 17th of April, Public Health Wales wrote to you to express their support for a policy change in line with the UK government. And then a few days later, 20th of April, Public Health Wales produced plans to support mass testing and bring Wales in line with England. It's not until we get to the 29th of April that the Welsh Government changed its policy such that all patients being discharged from hospital to a care setting would be tested regardless of showing symptoms. How do you account for the delay, the 13-day delay, between the policy change in England and the policy change in Wales?
Well, I cover some of this in my statement from paragraph 496 onwards. So at that point in time, I set out that I ask about testing of care home residents and release from hospital That's an email that I send to Dr. Orford and Dr. Goodall. That's then picked up by Public Health Wales officials, and we do then get more advice. And it's then like getting from that to then having the practical action on changing the policy as well. And again, it's one of the areas where there wasn't the sharing of information you'd have expected between Department from Health and others. So, and again, these things can happen because lots of things are happening at the time. But if the same information had been shared with us instead of being announced, then I think we could have been in a different position. What you then have to do is you've got to try and catch up with events. And I certainly do wish that we'd been able to move more speedily on not just changing our position, but then in making sure that we had the testing ability to implement a new policy effectively, because that's the point. If you say we should be doing something different, we don't have the tools to do it, well, not having the means is a really significant problem, and we eventually did get there.
You have said in various public interviews that the Welsh Government could have made the decision to test all care home residents and staff earlier. Now, given that there was clear evidence at the beginning of April that only testing those with symptoms missed up to half of care home infections, adopting a precautionary approach, should routine testing of all care home residents and all staff have been adopted in early April?
I don't think we have the testing capacity to do it. I think Chris Whitty has given the same evidence, and I think Dr. Orford commented on this in his evidence too. But if you want to say this is the policy, you then need to be able to do it as well. And actually at that time, I don't think we did have the testing capacity. And again, I think Chris Whitty's given this evidence that actually the testing capacity at that point in time was needed for people with symptoms. And again, you're thinking about all the risk that exists across the population for care home residents, for people in hospital, for people who need to get into hospital, either from COVID or non-COVID or potential COVID harm. And so you've got to deploy your testing in a way that deals with the resource you've got in volume terms and to then prioritise it. And that's the testing strategy or policy we had in time that, of course, Dr. Orford authored initially, and that then moved to a new group of officials. It underwent rapid change, and this was really difficult.
You say, it's paragraph 501 of your witness statement, you say there that the decision not to test all care home residents and staff was not a question of resource management. But as I understand your answer that you've just given, capacity and resource was in fact the reason that testing was not introduced earlier. Is that right?
No, I think it was our relative understanding about the value, and that's what's set out in the TAC paper. But even if our understanding had been further advanced and hardened, at that point, we still didn't have the tests available. And so you recall, I certainly recall having gone through all of the decision-making discomfort and making changes in policy on a regular basis, that actually the growth in our testing capacity was a real issue through this time as well. If we'd had both the knowledge, then actually it wouldn't have been the testing capacity, it would have been the testing capacity itself, not the knowledge. The point I'm making in 501 is the evidence that was available to me and the advice I was getting wasn't, you should do this if you have the capacity. The evidence wasn't there to say you should definitely do this. That wasn't the advice that I was getting. But even if the knowledge did exist, at that point in time, I don't think we had the capacity for the tests. So we'd have had a policy position we couldn't implement.
So forgive me for interrupting. What did you mean in 501? It wasn't a question of resource management? I'm sorry, I'd read that as it was a question of testing capacity, but what did you mean?
So what I'm trying to get over is that if the knowledge had existed, at the point in time, I'm setting it in 501, the knowledge and the advice there on testing all staff in the way we eventually did to have essentially blanket testing and then serial testing eventually too, that wasn't where our understanding was, certainly not across my desk and the advice that I was getting. However, if we'd had that advice, for example, in the middle of April, that actually you really should do this, and our advice is definitely do it, at that point in time, we wouldn't have been able to test all of our staff. So some people suggested this was just about not having access to tests, and that's why you didn't do it. And actually the point I'm making is, well, actually, we weren't being advised to do that anyway, and we didn't have the test. But the first point was, if the advice isn't there to do this, it doesn't really matter about the resources. But, you know, if we'd had the advice and the test, then we'd have done it. If we'd had the advice in a clear state saying this is what you should do, in early and mid-April, we didn't have the test to do that. Is that clear? I'm not trying to be confused.
Well, I'm afraid-
There's two distinct...
Should the statement read, instead of reading at the time it wasn't a question of resource management, should it read at the time it was a question of resource management, but more it was a question of our understanding of the position? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm saying it was our understanding of the position of the relative value of testing all those people as set out in the technical cell paper. That's the reason why the policy position didn't move. But if the policy position had been, at that point, you should do this, I don't think we'd have had the resources to deal with it. So for example, if as Mr. Poole is suggesting, that we all should have known, and that was the advice that came to me, for the sake of argument, if it came to me on the 16th of April and the policy position shifted then, I think when you look at the testing capacity we had on the 6th of April, we couldn't have delivered that policy. And so actually each week of increasing testing capacity was really important to be able to deliver against the position that we reached. Because in England as well, they had this challenge of announcing a policy that they couldn't then implement as well. The capacity for testing still needed to grow to deliver against the policy position itself.
We return to the chronology. So we're now around mid-March, and the inquiry has received evidence in Module 2 that over the weekend, 14th and 15th of March, the UK government took what may be considered to be a significant change of direction. So evidence being received that a body of scientific material by that stage had built up from a variety of sources. Officials at SAGE had been asked by Professor Ferguson what a epidemic with 4,000 deaths a day looks like, and there was much more data by that weekend on the likely impact on the NHS. That change of direction was communicated to you at a COBRA meeting on the 16th of March. We can have, it's INQ 40562110. Thank you. I suppose just clearing this one thing up, I think from those attendance records, it doesn't confirm your attendance, but I think in your witness statement you do confirm that you attended. Yeah. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
If we have a look at page 4, please, first paragraph. So we have there, Sir Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty told the meeting that the UK was on the cusp of the fast upward swing of infections. There had been 35 confirmed deaths in the UK, including the first COVID-19 related death recorded in Wales that day. And then if we have a look at para 2, the proposed intervention measures outlined there were agreed upon at this COBRA meeting. Mm-hmm. Now, those intervention measures would obviously have a significant economic and also social impact when they're introduced in Wales. Were you satisfied that there had been proper consideration by the Welsh Government of implementing these proposed intervention measures? And I suppose what I have in mind specifically is, as I spoke about earlier, the demographic characteristics of the Welsh population, so the impact on the elderly, the impact on the vulnerable.
So yes, there had been a proper consideration of the fact that if the virus is growing significantly as it is, and if we know that our population is vulnerable, then needing to act. And as we went through before the break, understanding the evidence picture on the 12th and 13th, going into COBRA on the 16th, even in that few days, the evidence picture was hardened on the need to do more. So yes, I was clear that we'd need to do that to prevent really direct harm, but in understanding the full suite of what that means for all the indirect harms, lives and livelihoods and everything around those, then I think it would be dishonest to try to claim that everything around that had been fully worked through, because the picture's moving really fast, and by then the Treasury haven't got through to doing, for example, understanding what furlough is going to look and how that's going to look. So I don't want to give you a misleading answer, Mr. Poole. So yes, I understood very clearly, as did the First Minister, COVID is growing. It's an even bigger problem than it was the other side of the weekend. And we need to do this, and we're signed up to taking measures together to do it. And that gives us the best prospect of protecting people here and indeed across the rest of the UK.
If we can look at another set of minutes now. These are COVID-19 core group minutes from a meeting on the 18th of March, so a few days later. It's INQ 3015172. Looking at paragraph 1, Dr. Atherton advised that the virus was probably circulating in the community. 136 reported cases in Wales, 2 recorded fatalities. If we have a look at paragraph 3, Dr. Orford advising, modelling suggested that the UK was 4 weeks into the curve, expected to be another 11 weeks before the spread of the virus peaked, whereas the NHS in Wales was 4 to 5 weeks away from maximum capacity. So just pausing there, you're aware, obviously at this stage, need to act urgently to stop the NHS in Wales being overwhelmed, correct?
Absolutely.
If we turn over the page, page 2, and have a look at some paragraphs there, starting at paragraph 11, dealing with schools. So there's a discussion about the policy on school closures, and it's noted here that SAGE was in the process of updating its advice for COBRA. So this is 18th of March. Have a look at paragraph 13, please. There's recognition here that once schools were closed, unlikely they'd reopen until the autumn term, so impact on exams would need to be considered. Now, we know that the decision was taken to close schools in Wales early for Easter this day, so on the 18th of March, and that was announced by Kirsty Williams, the then Education Minister. Ms Williams says in her witness statement that on the 16th of March, there was another COBRA meeting in which COBRA maintained its previous position that schools should not be closed immediately and were crucial for maintaining a frontline workforce. And she then goes on in her witness statement to say, even at 4 p.m. on the 17th of March, so the day before this meeting we're looking at, the Welsh Government was still working on the assumption that the best thing to do would be to keep schools open. Are you able to help us understand how the position changed so rapidly since COBRA on the 16th of March, still looking at the position, keeping schools open, Welsh Government working assumption the day before this meeting, best thing to do would be to keep schools open, and then we have the announcement made on the 18th of March that in fact schools are going to close early?
So what happened was the pace of events taking place. So we had the understanding that schools are part of transmission because people are moving around and mixing, whether it's a primary school and a school gate conversation, or whether it's actually the fact that adults are out and going doing other things, will often go and see other people after that as well. There's the unknown role of older adults, older children in particular, and their possible role in transmission. So all these things are unknown. What we do know is, and it's noted in the minutes, that if schools close, it'll be difficult to reopen them. You've got to rebuild confidence, you've got to possibly think about new ways of teaching and learning, and we wanted to keep schools open for things that are highlighted later on, both the impact on children's learning and outcomes, but also, as I pointed out regularly in my statement, that home isn't a safe place for every adult, and home isn't a safe place for every child. Having your children in school means there's greater visibility of what's happening. So there's a real safeguarding issue about having schools open. What happened was you had some schools closing because they had staff who were isolating, in accordance with our advice, having symptoms and isolating. So some schools couldn't stay open because they didn't have the staff to staff them. And in other schools, there was a growing group of parents who were anxious and were fearful for their children, which was quite a rational thing for a parent to consider. Is my child better off at home or better in school? So all of those things were happening. We found that local authorities, from the conversations we were having with them, I say we in the government sense, to then reaching an agreed position at WLJ leadership level, I think every now and again the leader of the WLJ is described as the chair. It's the leader, Andrew Morgan. And those conversations with the education leadership are agreeing that we should try to keep schools open. And then you find individual schools and then some local authorities break from the pack. And what we're finding was a disorderly closing of schools, and some authorities were acting. So again, this is the pace of events from the 16th to the 18th. It wasn't tenable to try to keep schools open. So to bring about an orderly conclusion, the decision was made, was the right decision at the time. And I still, looking back, think taking that decision then was the right thing to do in those circumstances. But it is one of my regrets that we couldn't keep schools open for longer. Some of that is what we knew at the time. An awful lot of it is what we subsequently learned about harm for children and young people's prospects for the future.
You attended a COBRA meeting on the 20th of March. We don't need the minutes to be brought up. There was discussion at that meeting about additional social distancing measures, so such as closing restaurants, bars, theatres, cinema, non-essential retail. You say in your witness statement, it's paragraph 221, that you agreed with these measures and wanted to see them introduced that night. Mm-hmm. I suppose my question is this. Given that there had been substantial reductions by voluntary means at this stage and measures had already been introduced, did you consider waiting and allowing more time to see if those measures that had been introduced on the 16th of March would take effect, and those measures alone would bring the R rate below 1?
No, I think the evidence was clear in the modelling that came from SAGE and the evidence of in the advice that our Chief Medical Officer had given, and indeed Chris Whitty in opening the COBRA meeting when he was asked to speak. It was pretty clear that all the things that we had done were not going to stop the growth of COVID at that point, and more significant measures were needed. There was a discussion about that. Then when there was agreement that something else needed to be done, there was then a discussion about the timing of it, which is what I set out in 221. And I was very clear that we needed to act as soon as possible. And that's what the overall conclusion was.
Now, we know that that evening, 20th of March, the First Minister announced that the Welsh Government would use public health powers to close restaurants, pubs, bars and other facilities. Day after, Saturday, the 21st of March, I think Welsh Government were told that there was going to be a COBRA meeting, but that didn't in fact go ahead. 22nd of March, Dr Atherton confirmed another 7 COVID-related deaths in Wales. That took the total number to 12. And I think I'm right in saying, so this is Sunday, the 22nd of March. That afternoon, you had a meeting with the First Minister, and we can see an email setting out a number of action points following that discussion. It's INQ 30336 so we can see at the bottom of that page, yes, as discussed with the First Minister and Minister for Health and Social Services this afternoon. If we have a look, please, page 2, and I think it's the final action point, yes, lockdown plan, so that's Reg Kilpatrick and team to prepare first cut so that we're ready either to respond to UK government or move separately. Would I be right to assume that at this stage, 22nd of March, there was no lockdown plan, and what was being suggested here is that Reg Kilpatrick and his team would go away and do a first cut of that plan?
Yeah, I think a first cut to come back to us, because we had thought that we'd be going to a COBRA the day before and a lockdown choice would be likely made there, and then it didn't happen. And so, part of our concern was whether, with all of the evidence around increasing harm and the extraordinary things that happened in that week, that we might get another week of not making a decision. And this is more about the Prime Minister's willingness to take the steps required. And so we need to think about, well, if we were going to do this ourselves, bearing in mind the comments we had before the break around the balance of who would take measures in action, what would that look like? And so we did have a meeting with a number of ministers, and I think one of the chief constables, I think it was the then chief constable of the South Wales Police, around if we were to do this, what would it look like? It's, again, a really uncomfortable conversation, because you want to go together with all 4 nations, because that then brings everyone with you. And, so that was definitely what we wanted to do. We had to prepare, well, actually, if that didn't happen, what could we do? What powers do we have? How fast could we move, and what would it look like? So that was it. We had a meeting, then we had COBRA, and of course, we reached the agreement that we did on the 23rd of March at COBRA.
Just returning to this, and I hear what you say about the reasons why a plan had not been put in place by the Welsh Government at this stage, and that's because you thought that the UK Government was going to be leading on this, and you thought there was going to be a COBRA meeting on the day before. But just to be clear, prior to this meeting, there was not a plan put together by the Welsh Government of what a national lockdown in Wales would look like. Is that right?
Not as a separate entity from what happened across the UK. So from the 20th, if you recall, there are significant measures outlined on the 20th on the back of significant measures on the 16th. So all of the practical points around getting ready, I forget was the 16th or a previous meeting we talked about shielding, getting ready all the data and information. There's lots of practical things to do. And, we would have to do those even if it was going to be a UK-led, UK government-led approach in terms of legislative powers. So we know there's lots we need to do. And as we then get to the 20th, and, it's going to be public health-based powers, not something else, we then need to think about how do we exercise those powers, and then thinking that we're going to make a joint decision on the 22nd, and that not happening, it's then we've got to have a more formulated plan about what we do if we have to make all of those decisions rather than if we make those choices together, as well as the very practical things we need to do around supporting vulnerable people.
Now, as we all know, the decision to lockdown was made on the 23rd of March, announced that evening by Mr Johnson and then the First Ministers in the devolved administrations. Just want to examine the decision-making of that day, who actually made the decision and rationale for that decision. If I can start, there's a Welsh Cabinet meeting on the 23rd, which you attended. We don't need the minutes displayed. First Minister advised Cabinet that you discussed a number of issues following emerging advice from SAGE on the rate of transmission. I'm right, there was no discussion at that Cabinet meeting about imposing a mandatory stay-at-home order in Wales, was there?
No, I don't recall that we did have that discussion. What I do think happened, though, is that we had a discussion about the measures that we'd taken and whether we need to go further. And actually, we had already had discussions around whether something like lockdown would be needed, because that was a familiar phrase by then. Something that no one had really discussed a few weeks before was now being talked about quite commonly, not just within the government, but of course, you'll recall as you lived it through, Mr Poole, in the wider public, the phrase lockdown had entered the public lexicon. And that was because of what was happening in Europe. And so actually seeing that and seeing our own cases rise, and the fact that there didn't appear to be another answer. So it had moved from might this happen to, I think, when would this happen and how would it be done? But we didn't have a specific discussion, if you like, around deliberately making a choice at Crowborough that would then be implemented. But ministers understood plainly what was happening around it.
There was a TAC briefing that's dated the 23rd of March, and let's identify it and then see if this was discussed at Cabinet. It's INQ 303129330. Do you recall whether this TAC briefing was discussed at that Cabinet meeting or indeed before the Cobra meeting that took place later this day on the 23rd of March?
I can't recall exactly, but I do think this was available to us before Cobra because of what it sets out and where we were. So my view was that we were going to need to do something, and the exercise we'd been through earlier in that day, I think it was on the same day, was about what we would do if we didn't get four-nation agreement. And so this is advice telling us all these things are happening around you and to the public. You need to make some choices. And the recommendations, I think, are pretty clear. And there's the SAGE assessment that's in here as well.
The Cobra meeting then later this day on the 23rd of March, that is where the decision to lockdown's recorded. We don't need the minutes up, but it's recorded in those minutes. And the inquiry's heard evidence that the decision to lock down was one taken by the UK government in advance of that Cobra meeting. Does that, you were obviously at Cobra, does that accord with your understanding, your recollection of decision-making on that day?
So that isn't my recollection of how it was presented. There were proposals and considerations, and then it was, the recommendation is, it wasn't we have decided to, are you coming with us from the UK government? But we were prepared for that and expected it. We'd sort of expected it the day before, of course. So it wasn't a surprise that that was the recommendation. And I can't speak for other people whether they already made a decision in the UK government to do that in England or not. But that isn't how it was presented to us. They didn't say, Boris Johnson didn't say, I have already decided we are doing this in England. I will now allow other people to explain why we have decided that.
when it was proposed at Cobra, you say in your witness statement that you agreed with the decision to lock down. The witness statement of the First Minister states he also agreed with the decision to lock down. Had the UK government not decided to lock down, would the Welsh Government have followed TAC advice and Dr Atherton's advice? Would it have imposed its own national lockdown in Wales?
I think it's hard to say, and I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm trying to be honest with you about all of the uncertainty we're managing with and dealing with. So we have this meeting to try and understand what would it look like, and particularly if you're an outlier, ahead of other action being taken. But you can also see the action being taken in neighbouring European states, and of course the Republic of Ireland had gone ahead and effectively gone into lockdown before this as well. So we may well have done, but I can't tell you absolutely certainly that we had decided that if we couldn't get agreement at Cobra, we would definitely be doing this ourselves. If there wasn't agreement at Cobra, we'd have had to say something about where we were, though. So it's possible that we would have got agreement around the cabinet table to implement something like a Welsh lockdown plan. It's also possible that we would have said, we think we need to do this, but we need to do it together, because there are lots of things that need to come alongside it to make it tenable for the public, for businesses that won't be able to operate. So it's not quite as simple as we're doing it anyway, do your worst. So that's what I can't honestly tell you what we would have done if we hadn't agreed at that meeting, but I would have been pretty shocked if we got to a Cobra at that point in time, understanding what the advice from SAID was because Dr Orford was at the meetings, and then not having agreed further measures to be implemented that are effectively the lockdown that we lived with.
Now, just obviously, as you'll appreciate, it's necessary to examine both the rationale for, but also the rationale against the imposition of the lockdown on the 23rd of March. Now, we've discussed the measures that were introduced on the 16th of March, additional measures introduced on the 20th of March. Now, obviously, on the premise that those measures were introduced and they were designed to work, and given that in Cobra on the 23rd of March, there is recognition within the minutes that there had been a significant degree of compliance. I think the drop in footfall was 28% in the high street. Travel had dropped by 60%. There was a 52% drop in socialising. So the broad direction of travel, one might say, was good. The question is, why not wait a few more days to see whether or not those steps that had been taken on the 16th and 20th of March were enough on their own without introducing a national lockdown that day?
Because we'd lived through the experience of the previous 10 days. From the previous 10 days of, the challenge of the rugby game not going ahead, understanding what that had done in terms of public communication and uncertainty. And even then, there were still people going out to large events together. Then the NHS decision about saying there's a framework to stop lots of NHS choices, still seeing, and that's a really big behavioural signal, still seeing that COVID cases are rising, and even some people are being more cautious. Actually, cases are still rising and rising. Then on the 16th, more measures agreed. Then on the 20th, more measures are agreed. And within that, in each couple of days, you can see more things moving inevitably in one direction. So if we had said on the 16th, look, we're not going to wait, we're going to go into a lockdown now, on our stated knowledge at the time, I think that's something that could have been justified, but it would have been much more difficult. By the time we get to the 20th and then the 23rd, I think the real difficulty is not acting, because you can see harm that's taking place right in front of you. And by then we knew that actually, not to see evidence about where you were compared to Italy on the curve, but that actually you need to take action, and then it takes time for that to feed through. So on the one hand, you can say, well, actually, you should have waited 2 to 3 weeks. In that 2 to 3 weeks, more harm would be created. And, and the point that the chair made earlier, you're not just following the science, you're a decision maker. If the science had said, look, let's act, we choose not to, that's your decision. The science says act, the science says don't act, and you act anyway, that's still your decision. And I don't think we could have justified not acting at that point in time. So the evidence had hardened significantly, in my view, between the 13th and the 23rd of March. 10 days isn't normally a rapid time for governments to take on board new information, but a great deal had changed in that time.
So do I take it from that answer that, as far as you're concerned, by the time you get to the 23rd of March, the mandatory stay-at-home order was absolutely necessary?
In my view, yes.
Had different decisions been taken leading up to this point, do you think a lockdown could have been avoided?
Look, I think lots of things are possible, and then you think, are they likely and realistic? And so you go back to January, February, and think about how COVID was largely introduced. You know, my understanding of the evidence, we saw this during the pandemic, was that most of the introductions made into the UK, including Wales, came from essentially the February half term. From people going into Europe, largely skiing holidays where you're indoors for a long time, and then multiple introductions are made. So actually, by that point, and this is the thing about going again back to the questions yourself and the chair asked about contain and delay, by that point, COVID is introduced. And then, when you see evidence of community transmission, the danger is that actually within a day or two, you've lost track of it, it's running well ahead of you. So if we knew all of that, we could have acted earlier. But we'd have needed to take the public with us, we'd have needed to have the coordination across 4 governments, the financial support as well. So actually, I think the real challenge was that we'd have needed to have made decisions much, much earlier, to have a greater state of knowledge. We'd have needed to intervene before harm was visible to the public. And that's actually really difficult because of the scale and the extent of the measures we needed to take. So I have thought about this a lot, not just in preparing for the inquiry, but frankly because of having to live with all the choices you've made and seeing the consequence of them. I thought a great deal about this, and I don't think there was a way to avoid the first lockdown. I really don't. The timing of it could have been different, potentially. And, you know, a few days could have saved more lives, but I honestly can't see that there would have been a way to have avoided that lockdown. I've not seen any persuasive and realistic argument that says, here's how you could have done it at the time.
Do I take it from what you've just said that you think that lockdown was imposed a few days too late, so should have been imposed, say, on the 20th of March?
You know, if that had been the decision, if that had been the proposal, then I think we would have said, yes, we agree. And again, that would have been my view at the time. In hindsight, I think, you know, if we'd gone a week earlier, we would have made a great deal of difference, because again, when you look at the pandemic curve, a few days matter, but a whole week would have made a difference too. But it took everyone some time to get used to the enormity of what was actually happening and the scale of harm and the scale of action that would be required as well. So at the time, I think it is fair to say that, you know, I was expecting there to be a lockdown decision on the 22nd. If it had been on the 20th, as opposed to extra measures to have the full lockdown then with everything else, I think we would definitely have been signed up to it. I think that would have been our view at the time. By the 16th or the 13th, given our state of knowledge at the time, I'm not so sure. And that's where I think a few days is reasonable and realistic. Another week or 2 weeks earlier, then you're definitely into hindsight, I think.
I want to next look at the period following the national lockdown up to autumn 2020. Now, imposing, as we know, a lockdown in Wales using public health powers meant legal requirement to review the regulations every 21 days. You describe in your witness statement that process for the 21-day reviewed. You say that it involved a careful consideration of the latest advice from SAGE, advice from the CMO, and then question to Cabinet would be, should the regulations be approved, should they be amended? 14th of April, that's the first 21-day review. If we can just have a look at a ministerial advice that was prepared for that. It's INQ 30145553. As we can see from that ministerial advice, it's copied to all ministers and deputy ministers. We see the recommendation there. First Minister is asked to agree to retain the full package of restrictions. Although the MA expressly states it's a decision for the First Minister, and the recommendation obviously asks the First Minister to take this decision, I'm assuming this was a collective decision that was taken by the whole of Cabinet. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, Cabinet, as I explained before the break, Cabinet meets and agrees, but the First Minister has to agree the decision, and then the regulations are then enacted.
The reason I asked that question is simply this. There was no record of a Cabinet meeting on the 14th of April, so that's the day after Easter Monday, and the next Cabinet meeting on the 20th of April doesn't discuss the 21-day review. So I just wondered how this ministerial advice was actioned and how the decision was taken. But is your evidence that it would have been a Cabinet decision?
That's my recollection. We'd agreed to do this. We'd agreed to go ahead. I can't reflect where it is in my statement, but having gone into lockdown, and then you'll see that there's a need in the regulations to undertake a review, and that's where we got into the cycle of 21 days.
We have received evidence, the inquiry has received evidence that on the 10th of May, Mr Johnson made a public announcement indicating a change in policy for the UK government. That was the change in public health message from stay home to stay alert. And the inquiry has received evidence that one of the main drivers for changing that public message to stay alert was that there were some within the UK government, including the then Chancellor, who were concerned that the population was over-complying with the work from home message. So they were, I think the view was, they were overlooking the part of the message which said you cannot work from home, then you should go to work and practice social distancing. Was that a concern that was shared by anyone within the Welsh Government or yourself, can you recall?
No, in fact, it was the public willingness to follow the basics that had managed to squash the curve and reduce infections. And I think actually, rather than it being a public announcement, it was a briefing to the press. I learnt about the change in messaging in the Sunday papers. I think it was a Sunday Telegraph that had an exclusive on it. And I think another paper, I think there were a couple of papers that were briefed. So the briefing had taken place on the Saturday, and we found out about it on the Sunday before going to a COBRA meeting later on Sunday, the 11th of May.
In light of the UK government's decision and the importance of consistent public messaging, do you think proper consideration was given to changing the message in Wales to align with the position in England? Particularly, I suppose I have in mind the issues that it may cause having different public messages across the land border between Wales and England.
We were acutely aware of the highly porous border. It's a more porous border than Scotland and England. There's a lot more social and economic transfer across the border. I've given examples in my statement, I think, of settlements that straddled the border. It was part of the reason why we were so annoyed, I'm being polite, when that significant change in messaging is made without an attempt to even have a conversation. It was a surprise to officials as well as ministers. And it's a really significant departure. So we did think about it, but our clear advice to us was this is the wrong time to remove the stay-at-home messaging. So it wasn't the sense of wanting to be different for different sake. It was far from that, and it wasn't our choice to be different. You know, if we'd had a discussion about it, we might have reached some agreement on some common messaging, or agreement on at what point would we move away from stay-at-home.
Can I just interrupt? I'm so sorry, Mr. Given. Apparently the cameras have gone down. We're still broadcasting sound, so I think we should continue. But the investigation's going on. Technology is wonderful when it works.
Quite so. We found that out in the pandemic.
So let's carry on, Mr. Paul. I'm so sorry to interrupt. Do you want to go back to, it wasn't our choice to be different. If we'd had discussion about it, it might have reached some agreement on some common messaging, at what point we could move from stay at home. That's where you got to.
Yeah, and I think that would have been the right thing to do. And it's from this point onwards that I think you can see more differences in the way that the four governments addressed this. And it was, I think it was a mistake and it need not have happened. But it's a choice that the UK government made consciously to make the decision to brief it to papers in advance of the COBRA meeting.
And given that the UK government and the Welsh government were both drawing from a very similar scientific base, how can you explain the very different messaging then that was coming from the two governments? Broadly,
The health advice that chief medical officers gave to their respective governments was similar. the 4 chief medical officers met on a regular basis, and there was lots of commonality and agreement. And even after we stood up our greater capacity through TAC and TAG in Wales, there wasn't huge dispute between what SAID were saying and what TAC were advising us. The TAC and TAG advice was, if you like, localised for Wales, context-specific, rather than giving entirely different advice.
Mr. Gethin, I'm told, unfortunately, that we do need
Oh my goodness!
to stop.
Video's back, but the sound has gone.
Oh.
Should we take a break now? And hope that by the time we come back, we have to have the sound, even if we don't have to see each other. I'll come back. Or should we take the 15-minute break now? We'll take the 15-minute break now, and let's hope it's all resolved by the time we come back.
Okay.
All rise. I gather we're now up and running for both.
My lady, I think that's right. I think both audio and visual problems have been remedied. So.
But I am going to say I appreciate it would be a great disappointment to those following online, especially any bereaved members of families who couldn't make it to the hearing centre. But because we have to finish Mr Gethin today, can't ask him to come back the rest of the week, then we are going to have to go on without sound or visual if we have to. But say I'll do my utmost to ensure we don't have to, but we have to finish, Mr Gethin.
My lady, thank you. Mr Gethin, we'd spoken about the 10th of May. I want to briefly look at the decision to reopen schools in June 2020. How involved were you in that decision?
So we discussed this at Cabinet, but all of, if you like, the legwork was led by the Education Minister. There were some meetings with the First Minister, some meetings that I attended, that the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, I think, was the lead person from the Chief Medical Officer's department around the conversations with both local authorities and education trade unions. And there's, if you like, 2 blocks. There's the staff unions representing support assistants and other non-teaching staff in schools, as well as the group of teaching unions. So that then came back to Cabinet, and we had discussions around how we'd use our headroom to try to get out of the restrictions we'd had, and signalling when we wanted all children to be able to go back to school at some point before the summer break, and the conversations that weren't successful on whether we could extend the school year either at the end of the summer 2020 term or at the beginning of the autumn 2020 term to bring it forward.
Just ask you to have a look at some WhatsApp messages, please. It's INQ 303888430. So these are WhatsApp messages between yourself and Kirsty Williams, who was then the Minister of Education. So we're looking at some exchanges on the 19th of May. Yes, we can start right at the top. You say, I spoke with MD, presumably that's the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, after the 9 a.m. call, sort out a meeting for you, for us, with Rob Alford to make sure that you get some useful advice from TAC. And then Ms Williams says, thank you, yesterday was not helpful. You say, what happened? Was it all scientific uncertainty and no practical sense of how you need to make choices or a dispute about where we are? Was it your understanding at this point in time that on this issue of school reopening, you weren't receiving the necessary scientific advice, scientific information to help you make informed decisions?
I think it was really about getting scientific advice and information in a format that helped you to make the choices. It goes back to the point around following the science. You still need to make a decision. You also need to understand what the science is telling you. And because there was still so much uncertainty, the difficulty is, as a decision maker, you really want more certainty to found your decision on. And at this point, that was important not just for the minister, the education minister. It was important to get staff unions and especially teaching unions to agree to go back to work. And of course, the leaders of local authorities as well, who have their own responsibilities as employers with governing bodies. So it's really about trying to understand how the scientific evidence can be framed and phrased in a way that helps to make that decision for the minister and indeed those other stakeholders. But it still has to be advice that they're prepared to sign off and sign up to. That includes, if you like, the evidence and the advice in its broader sense, including public health advice as well.
With the exception of schools, I think I'd be right in saying that the general pattern was that England and Northern Ireland eased restrictions and reopened the economy first, followed next by Scotland and then Wales. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, some have criticised the Welsh Government for taking an overly cautious approach to easing restrictions and reopening the economy. Do you consider that the Welsh Government was overly cautious?
No, I don't. We were always trying to balance the competing responsibilities and the competing harms we had. And it goes back to your earlier questions around the population of Wales being more vulnerable, about understanding how we do that effectively, how we take people with us, the point that I make in my statement regularly about trust. And it goes into the advice you're getting, at what pace you do things, and then how you use the headroom you've got, because each intervention in easing is likely to potentially bump up the rate of transmission. So do you keep all of your headroom to do a larger intervention, or can you use it to do something you can do at that time without risking going back into exponential growth? Those are all the things we were grappling with at the time. And of course, other people will judge in the wider public, and this inquiry will take a view on not just how we made our individual choices, but whether we could have done more and done better together.
I want to next ask you some questions about the Eat Out Help Out scheme. Now, the former Chancellor has given evidence to the inquiry confirming that there was no consultation with the Welsh Government before the UK Government announced that scheme on the 8th of July. And he, Mr Sunak, told the inquiry that such consultation would not have been ordinary policy and that the Eat Out Help Out scheme was within the competency of the UK Government. I suppose my question is this: do you agree with Mr Sunak that this is not something that you should have expected as the Welsh Government to have been consulted on?
No, I don't agree with him. You're essentially talking about the support you provide to businesses, and business support and economic development are plainly devolved in their broader sense. So business rates are devolved. There are other things that aren't devolved. And apart from whether you think it's devolved or not devolved, and Mr Sunak and I may just have to agree to disagree on that, although I think it's pretty obvious. There's just the point around the fact you're in an unfinished emergency, and it would make more sense to be able to have a conversation and to try to agree how to do something together. And I've seen the evidence that it wasn't just a surprise to devolved governments, it was a surprise to fellow ministers in the UK government and indeed public health experts advising the UK government on these matters as well.
Had you been consulted, would you have endorsed this scheme in Wales?
Well, if we'd been consulted, I'd have wanted to have a conversation with the economy minister, and I'd have wanted to have a conversation with our public health experts as well. And their advice is not particularly different to the advice that an evidence I've seen Jonathan Van Tam give about the fact that they would have said this is not a very good idea. It's likely to lead to a greater circulation and regrowth of the virus. So, I've covered this in my statement about what my view was at the time. It had already happened. It was a matter of fact. I think we'd have been unlikely to have said we're very happy for this to go ahead. We'd have had to factor it in properly to the choices we were making within our own 21-day review process, as opposed to it being an intervention that just cut across that.
Now, you say in your witness statement, it's paragraph 295, that you did not think it was helpful or productive to publicly criticise the UK government or the scheme at the time. Now, given that the protection of life is the preeminent duty which each government owes its people, if you or anyone within the Welsh Government thought that this scheme, as you've just said, might increase transmission and therefore lead to more deaths, was it not your duty to raise concerns with the UK Government?
Well, politics is supposed to be a practical business. And that means that when this has happened, and it's already out there, and you've got lots of businesses who, frankly, are genuinely worried about not just their livelihoods, but their broader health and well-being, you've then got to make choices about, do you pick a fight in public on this when there's zero prospect of changing the answer? And this is, of course, in an environment going from the 10th, 11th of May that we started at, where actually the disputes and disagreements between different governments are increasing. And do you choose another fight to have? So being clear that we're not certain about what has happened, and then you get the advice from your own public health expert saying we don't think this is a great idea, but lots of the people you represent and have responsibility for are out and using it. Now that's actually very difficult, and the choice is it better to say we think this is wrong and we're not prepared to endorse it, knowing full well the public response is already there, or do as we did, have to factor this into account when we make choices through our own 21-day review process, which is what we did.
Now, Mr. Gethin, I do understand the practical consequences of if the scheme had already been implemented and there were people using the scheme, then at that stage it may be too late. But the former Chancellor's evidence to the inquiry was that the scheme was announced on the 8th of July. It was not due to commence for a month or so later, and he said there was ample opportunity for anyone to raise concerns about the scheme between that announcement and its implementation. Why did you not raise any concerns in that period of time?
Once the UK government have made a decision and they've announced it on this scale, the real world truth is they're not going to roll back. And the idea that in the month, having made an announcement with his name all over it, Rishi Sunak was going to roll back, I think is, fighting with reality, and there is no point in pretending that.
It may have gone ahead in England. Would you not have been able to say to the then Chancellor, that's all well and good, but it's not happening here in Wales?
The problem is, how could we have done that? In practical terms, if you're saying they've taken powers they were to spend in devolved areas anyway, then actually there isn't a legal mechanism to override that. I think there should be. I think it's the wrong thing to do, but that's a different point outside the inquiry. But actually, once that happens, then no, there isn't. And Mr. Sunak has been determined on a number of fronts to do things, and this was one of them, and it didn't matter whether it was devolved or not. I mean, like I said, I think the idea that he said, we won't do it in Wales, you can have the money to do something else with, I mean, that's for the birds. Let's not waste time pretending that would have happened in reality.
Deal next with some of the key decisions that were taken in the period August to November, including the fire break. Now, the inquiry's heard evidence about further local lockdowns that were put in place, so Llanelli, Rhondda, Cwnnantave, Merthyr Tydfil, Newport, Bridgend, Blaenau, Gwent, Swansea, Cardiff, Llanelli, Newport, Talbot, Bangor, Vale of Glamorgan. All of those effectively local lockdowns that were imposed, the First Minister in his evidence to the inquiry has described as a failed experiment. Do you share his view?
Yeah, so the starting point was Caerphilly, which I announced in early September because of the rise in rates. What we saw initially was some fallback and then a plateau, and then rates started to rise again eventually. And all of those county-wide and then some of the more local lockdowns. So, Rhondda, Cwnnantave and Merthyr were then next, and I think Blaenau Gwent came soon after that. Then in Llanelli, there was a group of wards, and not the whole of Carmarthenshire. The nature of Carmarthenshire is it's not quite as compact as some of those other authorities. So we ended up following through on what we'd said in our coronavirus control plan about how we tried to react and deal with rises in the rate of COVID. So we're doing what we'd set out we do to try to avoid having to take wholesale national measures. And we found that there was an immediate impact, but it didn't mark a decisive turning back. So we ended up with, as you pointed out, a quilt across the country of most of the country being in some form of local intervention. So more of Wales geographically was in a stage of local intervention than not. And before the fire break, I think I covered this in my evidence, there were 3 authorities in North West Wales who we were talking about the possibility of a county-wide intervention to cover the rest of Gwynedd and I think Ynys Môn, and it may well have been Conwy. And we chose not to do that because we were literally rubbing up against having to make a choice about fire break or not. And so it wouldn't have made sense to have had an intervention for 3 days on a local basis to then have a national intervention. And so we recognised that in the sense of whether those interventions prevented us from being able to do national things, and yes, they did fail, they did not succeed. But I think it was the right thing to try to do them, and we'd set out that would be our approach.
You say at paragraph 298 of your witness statement, on the 18th of September, TAC noted that the situation was serious. Now, we don't need to pull up that TAC advice, but in short, that TAC advice was that a package of NPIs was needed to bring R back below 1, and that action would be most effective if implemented early. Are you aware that a circuit breaker or a fire break, so short period of lockdown, was recommended by SAGE on the 21st of September? Is that something that you were aware of?
Not immediately on the 21st, but fairly soon afterwards. So I obviously read the TAC advice because I read the full advice and I read the summary, and I had to approve the publication of the summary, which was, I think, the right thing to do from early on so people could see why we were making choices. And here again, saying you need to do something, that was what we were trying to do with the local interventions. And the challenge was, as we saw, despite those local interventions, we weren't seeing the growth of the virus capped or reduced. So that's why the advice hardened about, it isn't just something you might want to do, we really think you should. And that advice got stronger. It's how we ended up eventually having the fire break.
Let's just want to follow through the evolution of this advice so we can see the picture as we move into October. And you're right, the SAGE advice of the 21st of September, that is then translated into TAC advice on the 25th of September, which you say you authorised the publication of the summary. Para 304 of your witness statement, you say it was clear at this time, so this is 25th of September, that infection rates were rising and that action was needed. But you go on to say, we knew from events between January and February of the significant harm that could be caused by the virus spreading too quickly. But then you say, we were mindful that if we jump to a national lockdown too quickly, this may affect support for and compliance with that lockdown. So on the one hand, you're being told by TAC action would be most effective if implemented early. And on the other, it seems from your witness statement, you're concerned not to impose a lockdown too quickly. I'm interested in what informed your thinking at this point in September that jumping to a national lockdown too quickly might affect support and compliance with that lockdown, knowing what you did about public compliance back in dealing with the first wave in March and April and May 2020.
I think this goes back to the point the chair made again, that you have advice and then you still need to decide. And having had advice, you need to do something. We've got a range of measures we set out in our control plan just from the summer, so not a long time ago. And we say we'll try to undertake a series of local interventions to avoid going back into national interventions, because whilst the public had been fantastic, frankly, in dealing with a lot of significant intervention in their lives, to ask them to do that again in September, I think would have been challenging. We just got our children back to school. And if you're then going into a national set of interventions, you've got a real challenge on keeping schools open. And we'd recognised, not just the theoretical harm, but with children going back to school, some of the harm that is being crystallised there as well. So you've got all of these difficult challenges, and the politics are getting more and more difficult, both within Wales as well as between the Welsh Government and the UK Government. So, you pointed out about the fraying that really started really visibly on the 10th, 11th of May, and that carries on regularly. The Secretary of State for Wales, who gave evidence here, I think it really highlights it. So Simon Hart came here and gave evidence on oath that he thought that there were differences just driven by the politics, about us being different for the sake of it. And that's even after all the evidence has been given and all the other modules of this inquiry from public health experts in England, and indeed the evidence you'll have heard from Public Health Wales, Dr Orford and Dr Atherton here. And it's still Simon Hart's evidence on oath that we were just being difficult for the sake of it. And that is a real factor, because in the Senedd, we have a majority of 2 at this point in time. So it's not like the governing party in Westminster with a majority of 80, and if they can deal with 20 rebellious backbenchers, they're home and hosed. So actually, making choices within the politics is much more contested and gets worse through the rest of the autumn and the winter. And it matters about how we think we can take people with us in making really difficult choices when the release from the summer has only just happened. So this is actually very, very difficult. And it's one of the things about the behavioural side, as politicians and decision makers, you've got to think about all of those things and how you do take people with you. So it really wasn't as black and white as I would want it to be.
a week later, so we were talking about 25th of September, when you get to the 2nd of October, there's a rather more stark warning from TAC. Their advice was, unless measures bring R back below 1, it is possible infection incident and hospital admissions may exceed scenario planning levels. That advice doesn't get any better, gets, if anything, worse. So a week later, 9th of October, TAC advises still exponential growth, hospital admissions continuing to rise. Then there's a ministerial call on the 13th of October. Again, we don't need the note of that meeting, but it records the first minister updating Welsh ministers on a COBRA meeting the previous day, during which Sir Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance repeatedly told the Prime Minister that Tier 3 measures would not be enough to reduce the R below 1, but that a circuit breaker would. And it's at that ministerial call on the 13th of October that the First Minister invited Welsh ministers to consider a circuit breaker.
Yeah.
So is it right to say that until the 13th of October, Welsh Government had not started drawing up plans for a firebreak lockdown, despite the advice that we've seen from SAGE and then through TAC starting in mid-September?
So I think I was at that COBRA meeting as well. So we had been seriously considering the deteriorating picture. It's why we'd not made any significant further reasons. I think in my statement I set out that the only one was allowing skating rinks to open with certain restrictions around them. So we'd not moved to have further easements again. And in the messaging from myself and the First Minister in the regular press conference we ran, it was about the fact that the situation is deteriorating. And we're asking people to come with us and to think again about who they're having contact with and why. And despite all that, and our public-facing communications are very clear about this as well, the situation continues to deteriorate, even whilst you've got most of Wales in these local restrictions as well. And again, that's a really visible signal. So what we then have to think about doing is, well, now that we are clear that we have the powers, because in March, through March, that wasn't entirely clear, do we choose to do this? And if we do, what does this look like in terms of a firebreak? And actually what we wanted to do was to have a conversation, because we knew the same evidence and advice had been given from public health on a scientific basis as the UK government. But as I said with the politics, it gets worse at this point, because all through September and October, a point is being made by the then Prime Minister that he's not going to do what he claims Keir Starmer, as the relatively recent leader of the opposition, wants to do, and there are shots being fired at us politically as well. So at a point in time where we think we're going to need to do something and we want to be able to have a sensible conversation, there isn't a direct conversation between the First Minister and the Prime Minister. And in fact, the political rhetoric is getting more divided. And that's the context in which we have to make our choice. So that is then reflected in the Senate as well. So the Senate is much, much more contested through the whole of the autumn, and it gets worse in December, actually, than at any point through January, February, March, all the way through to June, July. This is actually a very, very difficult time to be making choices.
I mean, sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Gethin, but even more so, if given that these are, I mean, there's no easy choices to be made throughout the whole pandemic, but isn't it even more important that you have the scientific information and data to inform these decisions? So given that advice had been given from as early as 21st of September about a circuit breaker being what is needed by SAGE, by the time we get to this ministerial call on the 13th of October, and the First Minister is then inviting Welsh ministers to consider a circuit breaker, the inquiry understands that no modelling had been carried out for what a circuit breaker might, the effects of a circuit breaker might look like at that stage. I mean, why wasn't that work being commissioned at the end of September?
I can't recall, I don't have all the documents in front of me, when formal modelling started, because that modelling is on the range of interventions to make. And so understanding that you're going to need to have more NPIs introduced, whether it's the same as the March lockdown or less, you do need to be able to model that. And actually by this point, we've managed to get, I think there's the conversation with Swansea University where Professor Graveston and his team are leading and working on on the modelling advice for Wales. So actually we've got more of our own source of more bespoke advice to call on then. So actually and we actually did, I recall this in the papers we had, about different versions of sets of measures that could be undertaken to try to deal with the growth in cases that we're seeing. But it would be preferable if we could persuade the UK, and we know are seeing the SAGE advice, if they will take measures alongside us as well. And that didn't happen, obviously. So we did publish the summaries of our TAC advice. So the worsening picture wasn't a secret or a surprise, because we were not just publishing the advice, but myself and the First Minister in particular were actively pointing to it in the public press conferences we were running up to the middle of October. And we get to when we think we can't not do this. So we go and get the specific plan that ends up being the fire break. But even there, that isn't simple, because, as I know you'll see in lots of the evidence, I think you've been through it before, you need financial support to make it work. And that was hard, because the Treasury made a choice not to make it available in the way that it was subsequently made available a few weeks later in England.
No, I think, Mr. Gethin, I think my question was just really, if, in a nutshell, do you think modelling should have happened earlier than it did? Because we know modelling did take place. We know that by the time you get to the 15th of October Cabinet meeting that we're just going to come on to have a look at, there was modelling from Swansea University, as you said. We heard evidence from Professor Grevner at the end of the first week. But that wasn't being done until the middle of October. Should modelling have taken place for firebreak earlier, in the end, at the end of September?
In hindsight, if we'd undertaken modelling then, we've had a further basis to undertake action, but we were still trying to have a conversation through official means and others around whether the UK can be prepared to act as well, which was a fruitless course.
We can have a look, please, at those minutes of the. So this is Welsh Cabinet minutes, 15th of October. It's 4048796. We can have a look at page 2, please, para 1.4. So the minutes note here that the advice from the CMO, CSO and TAC all reflect the advice of Sir Patrick Vallance had given at Cobra, namely that the UK government's proposals for a 3-tier system would not stop the rapid spread of the virus, and a circuit breaker was the preferred option. If we have a look at the next paragraph, 1.5, please. Scientific advice was that a minimum 2-week lockdown was required. Just pausing there, was the Welsh Government looking at longer lockdown? So did you look at a 3-week or a 4-week or even longer lockdown, or was it always looking at the half term and it was always going to be 2 weeks?
So the model advice we got on the 15th had been commissioned previously, and the advice that we got as ministers was looking seriously at the 2 or 3 week options. And that's the advice that we considered, and we wanted to positively take half term into consideration for that, because you would get in some ways a natural break with the week in half term. Again, if we'd managed to move the school term around, we might have been looking at a 2-week half term in any event, but that didn't happen.
If we have a look at 1.6, please, in these minutes, that's the modelling advice from Swansea University. So a 2-week lockdown, potential to reduce R from 1.4 to 0.8. Then if we can please just have a look at, I think it's page 4, which might be the last page of these minutes, paragraph 1.21. We can see there recorded, Cabinet agreed in principle to introduce a circuit break to commence on 23rd of October to cover 3 weekends. Now, that in principle decision was not formally approved until Cabinet met again on Monday, the 19th of October. And then obviously the First Minister announced that evening that a fire break would start on the 23rd of October for 2 weeks. Why did it take 4 days to formally make a decision that had been taken in principle, as we can see from these minutes on this date?
My recollection was that it was both the work that was being done with partners and what this would look like. So making sure you're ready for the interruptions to schools, for the sake of it, but also in particular about wanting to understand what it was possible to do in terms of business support as well. So I think, again, it was in this period that the First Minister made another effort to try to get access to the new version of FUR that was going to be introduced. We offered to pay for access to it, but we were rebuffed. And so we had to have more than one option, what we could do if we did get that and what we could do if we didn't. And so there were some significant financial choices to need to work through that as well. And it was all about making sure that we would have in place not just the rationale for what we were doing, the expected result, but also part of what we said, we're taking on board this point about the advice from TAC, that if you're going to have more interventions and they're significant, you need to explain what they're for, what they're expected to achieve, and when you expect them to end. And so we were thinking about giving, the commitments on when this would finish and what would be in place afterwards, and work had to be done on what all of those different things looked like.
You say at paragraph 318 of your witness statement that the impact of the firebreak was effective. You say it reduced new infections and gave Wales an opportunity to reset ahead of Christmas. Now, the inquiry has heard evidence suggesting that, in fact, the firebreak wasn't as effective as hoped. So although infection rates fell for 2 weeks, by the 29th of November, Wales was, in fact, back above the level of cases it had when it went into the firebreak. And, in fact, by the 10th of December, Wales's weekly infection rate had risen to 480 cases per 100,000 people, which was double what it was before the firebreak. Do you accept that the gains anticipated by the firebreak were much more short-lived than had been modelled or hoped for?
Yeah, they were certainly more short-lived than had been hoped for. So we understood that when you take action, it takes 2 to 3 weeks for it to really feed through, whether that's new interventions on closing down or whether that's releasing interventions as well. So the pace of your reason as well as the pace of going into something. So, the measures that you saw and the impact at the start of the firebreak you didn't really see till 2 to 3 weeks later. And then, as we go back to more mixing taking place again, even though the restrictions were more than we had in place as our baseline before the firebreak, actually we didn't get the reset that we'd wanted to in terms of public mixing and engagement. And, the run-up to Christmas was really challenging. And we didn't know at the time about when the Kent variant, that was then renamed Alpha, was circulating. But that was definitely a factor in the much more aggressive growth we saw of COVID in Wales. And I think it's coincidentally that the timing of England's 4-week period of interventions was actually at a period of time when the Kent variant was circulating. So if they had not been in measures, I think they'd have seen more growth too. But we certainly saw those gains eroded quicker. I know there's been evidence given about 35 or 37 days gained from the firebreak, but we didn't manage the reset that we wanted to.
Let's look at this period after the firebreak and the lead up to Christmas 2020. In order to allow some mixing over the festive period, Cabinet discussed the imposition of MPIs, and we can see at Cabinet meeting minutes 27th of November, it's INQ 40022511. If we can have a look, please, at page 2, para 1.3. We can see the epidemiological evidence showed a rise in the number of infections, if left unchecked, would overwhelm an already stretched NHS. If we could please turn over the page to page 3 and go to para 1.9. Cabinet considered the measures taken within the rest of the UK, noting that England would be coming out of lockdown and enter a new stricter tier system. And then if we have a look again over the page, it's page 4, para 2.5, please. It was agreed by Cabinet that, on balance, the most appropriate approach would be to draw on the Scottish Level 3 model to create a bespoke solution for Wales to address its specific circumstances. Do you consider that a tier system ought to have been introduced in Wales earlier than the 4th of December?
Well, in hindsight, it would have been preferable to have done that. And we had, this again was part of the, if you like, the deal with the public for going into the firebreak was that a shorter intervention rather than a longer one that'll be harder and more difficult should give us more long-term gains, but that actually we'd need to have a reset in the way we went about our lives afterwards. And actually what we couldn't do was make that stick in the sense of still managing to keep coronavirus under control. So, we didn't manage to do that. And again, when you look back, actually having more restrictions in place after the firebreak would have helped us. the ideal, of course, would have been that we could have agreed on UK-wide action, because then you would have had a much greater prospect of resetting public engagement and understanding of what's at risk as well as what's to gain. But yes, plainly what we wanted to do did not work to the extent we wanted it to, and so looking back, it is again one of the things that if you had your time, you would do differently. I certainly would.
There was some TAC advice that I think you say in your witness statement was shared with you on the 5th of December. It's INQ 30228-579, dated, I think it's produced on the 2nd of December, shared with you 3 days later. If we have a look at page 3, please, second paragraph, I think it's the third line. The fire break had the intended impact of a short, sharp, early intervention to push back the epidemic by 3 to 4 weeks. Then it says benefits of this period of negative growth have nearly been lost, with case numbers, hospital admissions nearly reaching levels seen at the beginning of the fire break. If we can have a look, please, at page 10 of this advice, we see there some policy modelling, or the text of policy modelling at least. It's analysing their different policy options undertaken by Swansea University. And it is saying in the no intervention scenario, where the background R rate is assumed to be 1.3, the cumulative number of COVID-19 patients required hospital and ICU bed is estimated to be just over 8,500 and 1,500 respectively, with over 2,500 deaths. And in the third tier 3, I'm grateful, it's probably easier to see by reference to this table at the top. Thank you very much. So in the third tier 3 pre-Christmas intervention, which is estimated to bring R rate below 1 back to 0.9, cumulative number of hospital and ICU beds is estimated to reduce below 5,000 and below to 580 respectively, with less than 1,500 deaths. I mean, it follows that, putting it very simply, if more stringent restrictions were imposed, so for example a tier 4, effectively a lockdown restriction, the number of hospital and ICU beds and deaths would be lower. And yet it doesn't look from this advice that tier 4 or lockdown restrictions are in fact being modelled. Do you know why lockdown restrictions weren't being modelled?
Because going into wholesale lockdown at that point is a thing that we're trying to avoid. And we're trying to avoid that because of the hugely contested environment we're still in. And even though England have gone through their own circuit breaker, our experience of the last 6 weeks has not been that if we think there's a real case that the UK government will say, actually, have everything you need in terms of public messaging and support, never mind finance as well. And actually, I do think, all of us detected a real weariness from the public. There were some people who were desperately worried, and most of those people were acting stringently within the rules, but you could see in terms of some of the behaviour reporting about some of the other challenges about what people were doing, the level of mixing taking place. So you have to recall, of course, Mr. Poole, that for many people, Christmas is an unusually important period of time, and often nothing to do with religion. It is a time when people see friends and family they haven't done for a long time. So we had all heard and had from constituents and others, I've done everything you've asked me to, but I'm having my Christmas. And, so you've got these really difficult pulls to try to manage, as well as the fact that it's an unusually important period of time for the economy as well. And closing down the economy in the month up to Christmas has longer-term consequences for a number of businesses. For lots of businesses, how they turn the profit that keeps them running into the next year as well. So all of these things are there, and you have the public health advice. And it goes back to, again, questions you've asked me about not just health, but can you see the wider range of choices and impacts that you make?
There's a cabinet meeting on the 9th of December. I don't need to bring up the minutes of that meeting, but what was agreed in principle at that meeting was that Wales would move to alert level 4, so lockdown restrictions, from the 28th of December, if infection rates had not improved significantly by then. that day, the 9th of December, you received letters from chairs of 2 local health boards letting you know that they had concerns that the health system would be overwhelmed. And the same day, 9th of December, Dr. Goodall emailed you stating that there was a visible increase in overall and confirmed cases. And he added that cases were in fact running ahead of the number that he had shared with Cabinet as his personal worst case scenario. I mean, at this stage, is it not dawning on you that perhaps 28th December moving into Tier 4 restrictions is going to be too late? We should be bringing that forward.
Well, I was really concerned. In my statement, I cover this in paragraph 331 onwards, including the conversations with the Education Minister about schools. I sent her a note on the 10th of December saying that I think we need to move schools to distance learning. And the phrase I've repeated in my statement is that I was more worried than ever before because I could see the picture of harm building up. And this is the challenge about managing all these different harms across the public. Within these, you obviously have the direct harm from COVID, the indirect harm for people who can't get healthcare treatment. You also have the other societal harms that come from the interventions you need to take to deal with, health harm, whether direct or indirect. And at this point, I'm getting more and more concerned that the direct harm from COVID are going to overwhelm all those other things. And so that's why, schools are essentially your last big shot before you go to lockdown. So I think we'd introduced restrictions into hospitality that, again, was really difficult. And again, in the politics of the Senate, Plaid Cymru had started voting with the Conservatives at that point, opposing some of the measures we had. So all that's happening, and we're then still having to choose, knowing how desperately we wanted to get schools back open again. When I then say to the Education Minister, I think we need schools to go to distance learning, it's not a benign intervention. It's one that comes with harm. But I thought at that point, if we don't do this, we're going to see even more harm in a whole range of other areas. This really is difficult. Because you can see harm in every direction you look about your possible choices. And this period is what's covered in the documentary that SLC. I mention it because the cameras had turned up months before, and by the time we got to the fire break, and by this period of time, you'd forgotten they were there. So everyone's very honest in front of the cameras. And when I watched the programme back, I was surprised at some of the things that I'd said on camera because I'd literally forgotten they were there. It doesn't mean they weren't my honest reflections, they really were, about why we needed to act. And then going from this point to then coming away from the agreed Christmas easements across 4 nations.
Just following through the timeline in December, there was some TAC advice of the 11th of December. If we can have that, please. It's INQ 3022857. And we're looking at page 2, the top line summary, and I think it's the fourth bullet point. So the number of people with confirmed COVID-19 in hospital that had increased by 9% in a week, remained higher than the April peak, and above the red circuit breaker indicator threshold. Same in respect of ICU occupancy. So in other words, the indicator that had been set for when a further circuit breaker would be required had been exceeded. So this is advice of the 11th of December. Now, you say in your witness statements, paragraph 344, that summary advice was not received by you until the 15th of December. And we saw previously, I think, some TAC advice taking 2 or 3 days to come to you. Given the importance of this advice and the importance of the decisions that you are contemplating making leading up to Christmas, would you have expected this TAC advice produced on the 11th of December to come to you straight away?
Yes, so in the conversations, I think I'm talking to not just Andrew Goodall, but I think I'm talking to Frank Atherton pretty much every day at this point. So understanding that we've got real challenge, and one of our circuit breaker indicators is going to be breached, is part of the reason why I say to the Education Minister on the 10th of December, I'm really worried, and you should be worried too, essentially. And it's why my push at that point in time is say, look at what I'm being told by the NHS and look at what is happening in front of us. And if we can't act, there'll be more of this. And with all the harm that we gave up so much to try to avoid, not just in the fire break, but also in the March lockdown as well. So it's a very, very... It's difficult to say, not just we have a plan to do this if we need to, but then to actually have to do it is still something that you need to get through as well. And that's why we had a week of, daily meetings to get to a place where that did happen as well.
You say you were obviously speaking to Dr. Goodall regularly in this period of time. If we can have a look at INQ 303211014, it's an email from Dr. Goodall, 15th of December, and he starts, Morning Minister, some overnight thoughts. So he starts by informing you that medical directors have written outlining their concerns clinically about the NHS's ability to manage into January based on high community prevalence. And then if we go to the fourth substantive paragraph, so right down the bottom of this page, if we were looking for the tipping point, I think it is the data over the last few days and the pace of the impact coming through the system from community prevalence to the hospital picture. He then goes on to state that same paragraph, if the Christmas Day forecast comes forward, as is possible this week, Wales would be looking at between 3,500 to 4,000 beds in use through January, which would be 50 to 60% of normal capacity only for COVID. And he notes that at the peak in April, Wales was only at 15 to 20%. Now, that email appears to have prompted you to commission advice on moving to level 4 restrictions before the 28th of December. And we can see that advice, INQ 303211016. Let's have a look at the fourth paragraph. Their situation has considerably worsened over the weekend since Cabinet discussions last week. If we can have a look at the fifth paragraph, need to move into level 4 restrictions appears to be clear without the need to wait for further data. And then if we can perhaps just move to the conclusion, so page 7, I think it is, fourth paragraph on page 7. Yes, there is therefore clear rationale for moving Wales to level 4 restrictions at any point within the next 2 weeks. The point at which those restrictions come into force will need to balance the health implications of a delay with the economic and potential behavioural implications. Now, public health implications had obviously been the subject of modelling and forecasting. Did you consider at this point in time, so this is on the 15th of December, that you had sufficient information about the economic and behavioural implications referred to here in this note to make a decision whether or not to move into level 4 restrictions?
I think we knew there'd be really significant economic harm, and there'd be some people that would be furious and other people would be relieved. So it isn't that everyone would heave a sigh of relief and say, thank you. There'd be people who would be, as they were, deeply upset about what had happened. In the same way that, when international travel restrictions changed, people were furious about what had happened with their holiday. This is much more than that, and the harm is much greater. Over this time, I recall, I've thought about this since my statement went in. I had, there are regular calls of local authority leaders about different things. And I had a conversation with Hugh Thomas, who's the leader of Cardiff Council, and also with Rob Stewart, who's the leader of Swansea. And they both said that they would support the government if we needed to move again, because they were worried about the local healthcare systems. They were worried about the local economies. Cardiff and Swansea are on lots of big winter wonderland activities. It's a big deal for both cities about what they do. But they could see the figures being published as well, and they were worried, as indeed was I, which is why I'd asked about the case and was having that conversation with colleagues across the government, including with other ministers, about not waiting for another week's worth of data. But the balance between those is a very real one. But it was my view that we had a clear rationale to move ahead of the agreement the First Minister had reached with the other nations of the UK. And of course, as I've set out, the politics have got much worse the 6 months following the 10th and 11th of May. We finally get the UK government to re-engage with us. We reach a decision on Christmas with some pain and not little effort. And then I start telling the First Minister, within days of that, I think the agreement you've just reached we need to tear up. It's not straightforward. And this is the occasion where the First Minister did eventually end up being first among equals because the Cabinet was split as well.
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Because the Cabinet was split as well.
Thank
As
you.
we got through this, the Cabinet was divided. So the First Minister then said, well, and it was odd because what normally happened in Cabinet meetings was the First Minister and myself would broadly be on the same page in terms of measures that we needed to take. And I think that was important for Cabinet colleagues. If the two of us had been openly disagreeing with each other about course of action, I think that would have made life very difficult for everyone else and indeed for our officials. So it was a strength that there was genuine trust and engagement between us and the way that we spoke with colleagues in Cabinet without ever taking for granted if we turned up and said, this is what we think we should do, everyone must say yes. This is one of the few meetings where Mark and myself set out the case for two different courses of action. And I set out the case for coming away from that agreement and taking more intervention, and Mark set out the case for sticking to the agreement that we had reached, and also the point about whether changes should be made in guidance or regulation. So this is really very unusual for the Welsh Government in all times, but certainly through the pandemic.
And we know that on the 16th of December, the First Minister announced that Wales would move into a level 4 from Christmas Day, and that a smaller Christmas is a safer Christmas. We then have a Cabinet meeting on Saturday, the 19th of December. If we can have a look at those minutes, please. It's INQ 40048803. If we have a look at page 2, please, para 1.1. First Minister had updated Cabinet following the meeting he'd had earlier that day with Mr Gove, First Ministers of Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with the CMO and CSA for England. Informs Cabinet, as a result of a new strain of the virus, Prime Minister was going to announce significant new measures that would see part of England, including London, move into Tier 4 restrictions, in effect full lockdown. Needed to consider the impact on Wales. And if we can zoom out and zoom back in at para 1.5, please. Deputy CMO outlined that Public Health Wales had confirmed a new strain substantially more transmissible. Para 1.6, hospital admissions running ahead of the reasonable worst-case scenario. And I'm right, aren't I? Just cutting to the chase. The decision was taken at this Cabinet meeting to bring forward alert level 4 restrictions, so namely a lockdown for the whole of Wales from midnight that night.
Yes. This is what was the Kent virus became the alpha. So, yes, this is the Kent alpha wave that we're seeing. And actually, I think the evidence is that it ended up being not just more transmissible, but more harmful as well. Fortunately, every subsequent variation, I think, was more transmissible but less harmful.
And this is a decision taken at Cabinet on the 19th of December, but as we know, and as you just explained to us, you were advocating, along with Dr Atherton, for an immediate move to level 4 restrictions 4 days previously, certainly by the 15th of December. That was your position. Do you think this decision should have been taken earlier than it was?
Well, this is a discussion you have around the table. And it's important that around the Cabinet table you're able to have a discussion on what you think should happen. And then when we get to those meetings, as I say, that meeting where we went through the guidance about what we should or shouldn't do was, I think, the only occasion where the First Minister and I had overtly different positions in a Cabinet meeting. But you don't just have that discussion within the one meeting. There's all the things that go on around it. There's the advice that comes in. There's talking to colleagues about what it's possible to do. There's the conversation about the options paper that will go to Cabinet as well. So in all of those, I was becoming more and more worried about the picture that is unrolling and growing in front of us. And the case rates are real harm, because whilst we started a vaccination programme, the first vaccine is really hard to move around and to use. So actually, the great majority of the population are still vulnerable, whilst these cases are growing rapidly through our population.
Now, Mr Gethin, you deal with the easing of restrictions during 2021 into May 2022 in your witness statement, and obviously the inquiry will have regard to that. Going back to a question I asked earlier about the first wave, it has been said that those easing of restrictions throughout 2021, again, the Welsh Government acted overly cautiously. Do you think restrictions should have been eased more quickly than they were?
No, I think we tried to strike the right balance. And even now, having had lots of time to think about it, given what we knew at the time, I think we did the right thing. What we now have is the benefit of hindsight, where because of the extraordinary success of the vaccination programme, and to be fair, I said lots that's critical about the UK government, their choices around the advanced purchasing of the vaccines, I think, is a definite strength and a definite positive. And it meant that we had real hope going through the winter because we were able to vaccinate lots of our population and to deal with some of the harm. It gave us very different choices because without the vaccine, that lockdown would have been even harder and probably longer. So, you know, the vaccination gave us headroom to make choices, but dealing with the level of uncertainty about the level of population protection it provided, going through February and March in particular, we really did have to take seriously the advice we'd had, taking account of where we were before Christmas. And to give you an idea of how serious it wasn't just we agonised over these things, we talked seriously about whether we'd be able to have an election. And, you know, after 5 years in office, I'm quite keen that you go to the public and, you know, you've got to renew your mandate. But if we hadn't had progress, I'm not sure that we could have run an election campaign, which is really, really serious. But we managed to. I think the pace was the right one. With hindsight, if we knew how effective the vaccination was, we might have been able to have a different pace in doing that. But that's not the pitch on which we were playing at the time.
I want to change topic. There were some high-profile instances of ministers and officials within the UK government appearing to contravene COVID regulations. I have in mind particularly Mr Cummings' drive to Barnard Castle and his subsequent press conference in the Rose Garden in Downing Street. What impact, if any, do you consider that those incidents had on the public's confidence in the Welsh Government's handling of the pandemic?
I actually think the contrast reinforced views the public had about the Welsh Government. So there are always people who are sceptical, not just in party politics, but not clear about whether we're doing the right things. And there's a reasonable argument about most of the things that we did. So I wouldn't want to try to say that anyone who disagreed with the Welsh Government was unreasonable. That isn't what I'm saying. But we tried to be serious. We published the evidence. We tried to answer questions in press conferences. And I think there was a contrast. You could see at the start of the pandemic, confidence levels in the UK government were at record levels and actually ahead of the Welsh Government. Harm was done by the trip to Barnard Castle. You know, partly because I think most people thought that if you're worried about your eyesight, the last thing you do would be to pack your family into the car to test your eyes out. But I don't think it harmed the Welsh Government, and I think the contrast reflected positively on us in overall terms.
Now, you were accused of a transgression when you were photographed eating chips outside, sat on a bench, when the rules only permitted a single period of household exercise. Mm-hmm. And you've explained what colloquially became described as Chipgate in your witness statement. I don't want to go over any of this. My question is simply this. Does the fact that you maintain that what you did was within the rules, whilst others considered it was clearly not permitted, does that demonstrate the need for greater clarity in the rules at the time?
No, because I think there are two different points. The first is that in that period of exercise, where it was our one period of exercise together, the rules said that you could buy takeaway food and you could eat that and then move on. The challenge is that we also had in the guidance that, you know, going out for a picnic was not permissible. That's not really exercise. So people were saying you were having a picnic, but actually it was exercise and the food was incidental to doing, which was covered by the guidance. The challenge is once you start explaining all of that, then you do get into people wanting to throw sand in everyone's face about what the rules and the guidance really provide. And we had, if you like, two broad periods in how we ran rules. The first was essentially things are permitted if there's a rule that says they're permitted. And actually, you then end up with what we describe as a thicket of rules. And actually, that's a hard challenge for everyone to understand. We then moved into a broader-based definition of here are all the things that you can't do rather than things you can do. So we wanted to try to change the way to try to make the rules easier to understand with the guidance alongside them, giving examples. And that was because, we were regularly, we had people ask us very odd questions about very individualised activity and whether there was a rule that covered it. We had requests to write a rule saying that it was or wasn't. So, and again, that was a learning point. You can't have a rule for everything because that's not a fair fight for the public to understand what you want them to do. And then having a more broader approach still comes with other challenges, but actually, I think that second approach was better than the one that we'd had at the outset.
Final topic, long COVID. You deal with this in your witness statement starting at paragraph 525,
Yes.
and you make plain that from the spring of 2020, the Welsh Government identified the likely need for rehabilitation of people recovering from COVID-19. And in May 2020, we know that the Welsh Government published a national framework for rehabilitation that was then followed in the summer by a further suite of guidance and resources to support health boards model their population needs and plan and develop local rehabilitation services. To what extent, when you and your colleagues became aware of the long-term after effects of COVID-19 and the long-term consequences of infection, did that understanding feed into the debate about the mechanics of MPIs and then subsequently the relaxation of restrictions?
I can't remember exactly when, but we knew that with a respiratory disease, but also affected internal organs, it would be entirely possible that people would have long-term consequences. And the phrase long COVID, I think I first heard it through the summer 2020. So we knew that there'd be people affected, including in groups that weren't typically vulnerable, but there would always be people who would become ill, and indeed there were sadly people that died in virtually every age group. So then thinking through not just our framework on rehabilitation and actually how you help people to get fit and well after a serious illness, but those people who with a long-term condition that can vary as well, because there isn't one form of long COVID, it's the long-term consequence of people who have had COVID, and a lot of it is individualised. And then how do you then factor in that both in your treatment and care provision framework, but also in the restrictions as well? Because this is part of the overall population risk. So, as I said earlier, you've got a population in a hospital, a population that needs to get out because it's the wrong place for them, somewhere for them to go, and you've got the population in the community, and then everyone else in age groups. They should be less vulnerable. And the people who have long COVID were not necessarily people like me who are in a group where you get access to the flu vaccine. I've got a long-term kidney condition from an illness I had when I was much younger. So that's what makes me more vulnerable than my age group. For other people, they have long COVID and they don't have any of those vulnerabilities that pre-existed. So it's another area of uncertainty. Even now, compared to when long COVID was first used as a term, we still don't understand enough about how to do it and how to help people to both understand who's most likely to be susceptible, but then how you help and support people who do have long COVID, and to do it in a way we're not just saying what's wrong with you, but actually to understand how do we help you to be able to live with and hopefully improve the healthcare conditions you have, but also be able to do all the other things you still can do as well. And it's a direct challenge because we have staff like this in the Welsh Government and how we support them to change their work patterns as well. So it was a factor, but it was a factor that was covered by lots of uncertainty. And there's still, I'm afraid, lots of uncertainty now.
Mr. Gethin, they're all the questions I've got for you. My lady, there are core participant questions, but I wonder...
There are, and given I think it's about 35 minutes worth, I'm afraid, Mr. Gethin. So for the sake of the stenographer, I suggest that I will leave. It'd perhaps be helpful if not many other people did leave, so it doesn't take quite so long to reassemble. I'll just leave for 5 minutes, just to give the stenographer a chance to rest her fingers. Sorry.
No problem at all.
All eyes. I'm sorry everybody's been boiling. I think we need an inquiry into heating systems and ventilation systems.
Yeah.
Ms. Heaven.
Thank you, milady. Good afternoon, Mr Gething. I represent the Covid-19 Brief Families for Justice Cymru. Can I start with the topic of testing for healthcare workers? And we're looking here at the second wave, so autumn and winter of 2020, just to give you a bit of the evidence first. So on the 16th of November, the UK government introduced testing through lateral flow tests in England for all healthcare workers in hospitals. However, it was only on the 4th of December that you announced that the Welsh Government would roll out testing of healthcare workers from the 14th of December 2020. But it was widely reported by the BBC, in part following comments from the British Medical Association, that in Wales, this lateral flow testing didn't really roll out properly until around mid-March. So given that evidence, and that's the evidence that's before the inquiry, just so you understand, will you accept today to the inquiry and indeed to all those affected by these decisions that the Welsh Government and indeed you as the responsible Minister for Health and Social Services failed healthcare workers in Wales, firstly in not giving them access to lateral flow tests at a time when we know they were available in England from the UK Government, and secondly in failing to ensure that healthcare workers actually got those tests in a timely manner. So will you accept that today?
So I need to look at not just the decision making, but what's happening at the time with practical access to devices and how and when information was shared about the access to them. Because during the course of the pandemic, Dr. Orford regularly updated us on some of the changes that were being made to try to have point of care testing, so reliable test device that could give you a result in a short window of time, not the overnight testing that otherwise had happened. So I'd need to look at the detail of what's in the evidence before the inquiry about when that information is available, about both the fact that there is a reliable device, then how it's been procured, because I think these were procured through the national testing programme run by the Department for Health and Social Care in the UK Government, then how our share is then used and where they're distributed. I've seen the reports around where they reach people at different points in time, but I'd need to understand where and how that problem was in the system, whether it's widespread or individualised.
I don't want to interrupt because we've got limited time. Just to focus you though, will you not accept though that Wales was at least a month behind the UK Government in introducing lateral flow tests and that this was an unacceptable delay? Will you not at least accept that?
Well,
a month behind.
I'd need to have a look at the evidence directly on when they were available and how they were distributed, and also, of course, the access to alternative tests, because testing on the PCR overnight tests were available through that time as well. So I'm not trying to be difficult.
Not accepting it. Okay.
I'm not trying to be difficult, counsel. I just don't want to be manoeuvred into a corner to accept something when I can't see the advice and the evidence you're basing the question and the proposition.
Let me move on to the next topic then. Fair enough. Let me move on to face coverings, okay? So let me situate you. This is your 9th of June press statement, and I'm sure you recall that. As you will know, this was a significant statement because this was the first time the Welsh Government were recommending face masks to the public in Wales where they couldn't socially distance. I know you're looking at your witness statement. It doesn't really feature...
No, I was looking at the new documents that were provided during the course of the hearing.
I don't think it will be that. But if you just listen, it's obviously the first time the Welsh Government are recommending face coverings, and indeed yourself are recommending that. It's also significant because 4 days before, as you'll recall, the UK Government had mandated face coverings on transport. So this was there was a lot of divergence in face coverings, as you know, with the UK Government, but this was a significant one because it was going to be mandated on trains in the UK, in England. So what that meant is you could be taken off a train and given a fine in England if you didn't have a mask on, but that, of course, wouldn't happen in Wales. One more bit of context. This was happening because the World Health Organization had changed its guidance and it was telling governments to recommend face coverings. Now, the inquiry has heard, as you know, from Frank Atherton, and he's accepted that his advice and the Welsh Government decision to diverge on face coverings became confusing for the Welsh public and weakened public messaging in Wales. And Anne John, the behavioural scientist from the TAG subgroup RCBI, also told the inquiry that the Welsh Government's approach was confusing and damaging to public trust, and she stated that a Four Nations approach would have been better. So, first of all, do you agree with the evidence of Frank Atherton and Anne John?
Yeah, I think on face coverings, if we'd had a more engaged four-nation conversation, we could have reached a four-nation decision. As this and on other matters, the more engagement we could have had, you reach compromise and trade-offs, but the benefit you get is consistency for the public.
Well, the CMOs were engaged, you see. The CMOs were all talking to each other. So did you probe Frank Atherton, who was obviously giving you advice along with TAG? We know that, to understand whether he had sought any behavioural advice for the theories that he was coming up with on the three harms, or from TAG RCBI. So did you question him as to whether he had any advice that was different from what the other CMOs had to justify divergence?
So we had a number of conversations, myself and the First Minister and the CMO, around the advice around face coverings and the position that we're in. I know some of this is in my statement, I think some of this in the First Minister's statement as well. And to be fair, Dr. Atherton has recognised this was a live conversation, and he was not persuaded of the evidence at the time that masks would be a positive addition to what we were doing. And again, he's reflected in his evidence to this inquiry that in hindsight, he would give different advice now. And I think that's honest. And we were well aware of the challenges on transport, on buses as well as trains, actually, on masks.
Can I ask you then, about your public statement? I've listened to it, it's obviously available. You don't explain to the public, do you, why it is that the Welsh Government is taking a different position to the UK Government? Do you not agree that in not explaining why you're doing something different and addressing that you weakened public messaging, that you undermined public confidence in the science, and in all likelihood, you probably risked encouraging non-compliance with the rules because you didn't grapple with divergence? Is that a fair comment?
No, I don't think it is a fair comment. If you look at what we were doing on the 9th, where we'd advised people it would be useful to wear masks in enclosed spaces, and again, reiterating the advice around masks where there are health and care is being provided. That's what we did. And the process to then get to having those as mandatory, we'd moved from saying, actually, these are useful things to do. So we're guiding the public to make their own choices. And I think actually most people welcome it. We then moved to actually having it mandated. And of course, we end up sometime later where we're still mandating face mask usage in closed spaces when the UK government aren't. I think when it comes to public trust and confidence in messaging, this is one issue. Look at the overall sweep. The reality is that the great majority of the public were coming with us through the summer on the pace of easements.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Sorry to stop you, but as I said, we have got limited time. The next issue I want to ask you about is medical masks for vulnerable groups, because the other significant thing we know is in the WHO advice in June is that those who are over 60 who are vulnerable with comorbidities, the WHO is saying that they should have access to medical masks where they cannot socially distance. I'm going to ask you, first of all, to look at some TAG advice from the 8th of June. So this is the day before your statement, please, because this information appears in the first draft of the TAG advice. So if we could get up, please, INQ 30s 327 606. And it's page 5. And that should appear on the screen in front of you. Do you see that there? That's the TAG advice on masks, coverings and medical masks. And you can see in the first paragraph there, it's in light of changes to policies in England and the WHO advice. Do you see that there?
I can see that, yes.
And if we turn over, please, to page 7, so this is a couple of pages down, we see at the top there, I'll read it to you, it says, there would be benefit of recommending and in certain circumstances providing medical masks to people who are more likely to have adverse outcomes from contracted COVID-19, e.g. shielding individuals, BAME, homeless, over 60s. And it says the effectiveness of medical grade face masks for personal protection is dependent on wearing them correctly, etc. So essentially, there's a tag advice. We know this is the 8th of June, which is essentially reflecting the advice from the WHO. And if we just go down a few more pages for completeness to internal page 15, we can see the WHO advice there. If you look at that box at the very penultimate box line, settings where physical distancing cannot be achieved, an increased risk of infection and or negative outcomes. Do you see that there? It says a vulnerable population, so over 60, comorbidities, and the protection that you need, according to the WHO, is a medical mask, isn't it? Okay. Now, what I want your assistance on is this. What we can see in the evidence is, between the date of this tag advice and your public statement the following day, there appears to be, and on that day of your public statement, the tag advice is published. The reference to medical masks is completely gone from the second tag advice. Of course, you're not saying anything in your public statement, are you, about medical masks on that day? So it's just to understand if you can assist with how that happened, and in particular, how the tag science advice came to be amended. So if I can ask you about a second document, please. And this is INQ 302155454. If we just keep that up for the moment. This is, if we can go to the first part of the email chain, this is an email from Toby Mason on the 9th of June at 10 a.m. Do you see that there? Okay.
It's in front of me?
Yeah. So the context here is we know that there was a 9 a.m. meeting at which your press statement was discussed, and we've seen some WhatsApps between Shan Morgan and Toby Mason talking about how that meeting was a bit muddled. Do you recollect, were you at that meeting at 9 a.m. on the day you gave your press statement?
No. I would undoubtedly have been busy, but I wasn't in this meeting.
Are you sure about that? Or I just want to be very clear with you. Are you sure, or are you saying you can't remember now whether or not you're at that meeting?
Well, I don't think I was, because I was in a number of meetings, and look at these. I don't ever recall being in a meeting with Toby Mason and Lee Waters discussing this in the circulation list.
All right, well,
If I had my ministerial diary, I could be more clear about whether I was or wasn't there, what I was doing at the time.
Well, let's look at this email.
Do you have
then.
the diary available or not?
Well, no, I'm not permitted to put that to you, but I think this email probably will give you some assistance. So if we look at it, please, it's the 10 a.m. email from Toby Mason to Jane Runnacles and others. I'm really concerned about the handling of the 12:30 press conference following the 9 a.m. call. I don't believe that any announcement beyond a position on non-mandatory face coverings following the WHO change of position is deliverable in comms terms in a way that will not raise very significant questions from a large number of stakeholders and the public, including those brought up at the meeting. As raised at the meeting, the tag paper, which is the one we've just looked at, will bring with it a huge number of queries and demands for us to take a policy position with really major implications like the provision of medical grade masks to vulnerable people. Can we distill the announcement to a series of bullet points now and work on those urgently and agree with the Minister for Health and Social Services, that's you, isn't it?
Indeed, at that time.
That any questions beyond these, and specifically on the use of medical grade masks, will be pushed beyond today to the more detailed sectoral guidance developed with stakeholders, and a full tag report will be published once there's a clearer position on all the issues. So if we just move up for completeness, we then get a response from Lee Waters back saying, agreed, I think Vaughan's oral summary was defensible, but I think that releasing the paper at this stage is a hostage to fortune. So would you agree with me that it would appear, certainly from that summary, that you were at a meeting, certainly before then, this is 10 o'clock. You must have been, mustn't you? Because there's reference here to you giving an oral summary that was defensible.
No, I'm not at all sure what the things are referring to. That's why I asked for my diary, because I could then tell if I was in the meeting or not.
Okay. Well, I'm going to suggest...
I'm just trying to not to give you a misleading answer.
Okay. Well, it says here oral summary. So in whatever context, though, would you accept that you presented some sort of oral summary and you have given very clear advice that the tag paper on vulnerable people and medical masks that I've just shown to you needs to be pushed off beyond today. So in other words, it wasn't going to be told and presented to the Welsh public on the 9th of June. That seems to be what's being suggested in this email, isn't it?
Well, it's possible. And of course, this is one of the occasions where the scientific advice is actually linked to policy and development. Because if you say this is what we're going to do, you do then need to say, and where will the deliverability come from? And at that point in time, not just the volume of masks of the right type, but how you get them to people.
Okay.
So if you're getting yourself to a hospital, for the sake of argument, and you're in a vulnerable group, you can probably get a mask on the way in, as you do now on a regular basis. If you're getting the bus or the train and you need to have a mask, how do you get masks to those people? In the end, what we found was that on buses, for example, they ended up putting masks at the front of the bus so people could have them and
But
take
can
them.
I just pause you there for a minute? Because what I'm putting to you is quite serious. It's that TAG scientific advice was amended on your say-so and not presented to the Welsh public, when underlying that advice was very clear guidance from the WHO that vulnerable people needed access to medical masks. So that's what I'm suggesting to you. The scientific advice was amended on your say-so.
Oh, I see. So we've gone through this on a number of occasions where we had advice up to us to then be published.
Okay.
And the publication of the advice is to help inform the public about choices we have recently made. When we're still making a choice, then we would say that actually this is still policy in development, and we need to understand what we're going to do about it as well. So it sounds as if the accusation is that I'm deciding what the science is when I'm not. I need to be clear, though, as indeed does the whole government, that if we're saying we're going to make a change and here's the science that underpins it, you're able then to deliver against what that recommendation is. And I think that's sensible.
Just finally then on this topic before we move on, we can't find any evidence to suggest that the Welsh Government ever told vulnerable people in the community in Wales that where they were over 60 with comorbidities, that the World Health Organization was recommending that they use medical masks in the community. So is this right? Was this vulnerable cohort of people in Wales never told by the Welsh Government what the World Health Organization was saying that they needed? Is that right?
I'm really not certain, and I don't want to try to pretend I can piece through the documents to find an exact statement around that. We did, of course, issue lots of guidance around use of face masks. And, of course, one of the things we were being advised in the same science was actually to try to draw a distinction between masks and face coverings. And that was a distinction that never stuck.
Okay, can I move on? I've got 3 minutes left, so can I move on to the fire break, please? Next, final topic. Dr Orford states in his statement that there were few occasions when Welsh ministers made decisions that appeared inconsistent with the advice offered by TAG. And he said a notable exception where the science didn't align with the important decisions included the post-fire break period, where TAG advocated for control measures that would keep rates of infection lower, but for different reasons this was not followed. And he tells us that the national population protections that were introduced after the fire break were insufficient to control the growth of the epidemic. So will you accept today then that you were part of a cabinet that rejected scientific advice that was given to you by TAG in autumn 2020 about how you should ease restrictions post-fire break, and that this led to measures being introduced that led to a resurgence of the virus? Will you accept that? Because that's what Dr Orford is saying.
I think you're characterising what Dr Orford said in rather more definitive terms than he did. If you look at where we were and the advice on the length and the depth of the measures in a fire break, the opportunity to reset, the gains we thought we'd make and what we thought we'd be able to in resetting public behaviour, that is bounded in with all those other harms that take place as well. And we had to balance and weigh all those up. And as I said in answering questions from Council to the Inquiry, the politics and the environment which we're asking people to make those choices have changed significantly and become much more contested, frankly, much more bitter. And unpleasantly so.
1 minute left. Final question. Were you ever made aware that the Swansea modelling team had results that showed that a 4-week fire break would suppress the virus deep into December? So that's a 4-week fire break. That if that had been employed, it would have suppressed the virus deep into December. Was that ever told to you as a minister? I know you were told about 2 to 3 weeks, but we were told about 4 weeks.
I don't recall seeing that. That doesn't mean that I didn't, but I generally don't recall seeing that. In all of the, the 5 EVA Arch files of evidence I've read, I don't recall seeing that. From what I'd seen at the time, I have seen a reference to it in the files I've read for this hearing, but I can't recall seeing that in September or October
Thank you very
2020.
much. Thank you, Milady.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evan. Mr. Straw.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I represent John's Campaign and Care Rights UK. A number of people working under your responsibility have said that indirect harms were less well understood or evaluated than COVID harms, or that insufficient attention was given to them. So to give a few examples, Professor Gravener, the Chief Information Officer, Andrew Nelson, Professor John Watkins, and moving on in time, the TAG's 5 harms paper in July 2021. Now, since an accurate estimate of all harms or benefits of a particular restriction was necessary in order to decide whether it was appropriate, would you agree that more should have been done to ensure that indirect harms were accurately evaluated and taken into account?
This goes into the balance to some of the questions that started with Council Inquiry, I think, before lunch, around how you assess the speed at which you need to act with the direct harm that you know is possible, then probable, and then much more likely, and how you assess that direct harm in terms of the risk of the NHS being overwhelmed with avoidable mortality and long-term ill health, the impact on the whole population is seeing the NHS collapse, against what you know are some indirect harms that you can see and others that you only see once you take some of those measures. So, we talked about the position, and I think I meant to do in response to questions to Council, that putting care home residents into individual isolation is not necessarily a benign and harm-free intervention, because that might protect them from seeing other people in the sense of not getting COVID from them, but it has an impact on them and their well-being. That isn't just in a mental health sense, it's in a real and physical sense as well. And so understanding all of those things is part of what you're trying to balance. If you wait, though, to get chapter and verse on all of those, then events will have run ahead and you'll be out of time. So, that's the difficult challenge. The science, you have the public health advice, but you have to make the decision. And sometimes that is imperfect evidence that you have to deal with, but it's still your duty to choose.
On a systemic or learning lessons basis, do you, like the individuals under your responsibility, feel that it would have been a benefit to you to have not just this sort of carefully evaluated COVID harm evidence, but also the other side of the picture, the indirect harms that would be arising from those restrictions? Do you agree that it would have been better to have that sort of evidence?
So look, it was never outside the mind of ministers, certainly not me, and I don't think it was outside the mind of my colleagues either, because of the discussions we did have, that COVID was only one form of direct harms. We started off with the 4 harms that we had, about, that included direct and indirect harm in health service terms, but also indirect harm to the wider population as well, and the economic harm being done. So it was always a factor in our decision making. If we could have had more information, more clarity about what that indirect harm would look like, that would always have been useful. But I think my central point, when I'm trying to be direct and honest here, is that even if you had more information about those indirect harms, you'd still be faced with pretty terrible choices to have to make. And you can't walk away from your responsibility as a decision maker. And, certainly the case being the health minister, and certainly the case if you're the first minister this time, you've still got to choose. And so sometimes you're choosing between harms. You're not choosing how to avoid all those things.
Thank you. The next topic is about stakeholder input. So at 403 of your witness statement, you note that there were some opportunities for stakeholders to give input, and you in particular you note the Older People's Commissioner and Care for in Wales. First question about that. Do you agree that it was very important to ensure that key stakeholders could provide their views and evidence about important decisions? For 2 reasons. Firstly, the decisions had potentially very serious adverse impacts. And secondly, because specialist knowledge of a particular sector would be helpful. Do you agree that getting that stakeholder input was important?
Yes, and it was a feature of what we tried to do. So not just the Older Persons Commissioner, but the Children's Commissioner and others were engaged, both individually with policy areas they engaged with on a lead basis, but also through the Shadow Social Partnership Council, where you did gather together. So you'd have all the commissioners, you'd have trade union stakeholders, businesses and the third sector, local government, and police in Wales, even though they're not a devolved service, there was a conversation with the police board that was always fed in. So that Shadow Social Partnership Council had a wide range of stakeholders, not just to understand what the government were proposing, but to actually listen to what those people had to say. And those conversations did have meaning for ministers and indeed our officials who were advising us on the choices that we still ultimately had to make.
A number of stakeholders have complained that their views or recommendations weren't adequately or promptly acted upon. Just to give one example, the Older People's Commissioner noted that she'd given, she'd said on the 14th of April that she considered it was urgent for there to be an action plan prepared for the care sector, but she didn't consider that an appropriate action plan was produced until the 30th of July, so sometime later. Would you accept that that a number of the views of stakeholders weren't adequately and promptly acted upon? And if so, can you explain why that might have happened?
So I think it's fair to reflect a couple of things. The first is sometimes you disagree with stakeholders. It doesn't mean that they haven't been heard or appropriately listened to, but there'll always be a time when someone is urging a course of action on you that you choose not to take. And, reasonable people can and do disagree on the same facts. There's also, though, the point around whether you agree that the manner in which something has been done and whether you believe you've been listened to as well. So that's different to whether you just disagree. It is how you do it. And there's then the point about your capacity to do something as well. And at various points in the pandemic, I think some of our stakeholders overestimated the capacity of the government to do lots of things at the same time. And of course, there are competing challenges and objectives that different groups of stakeholders have, and they're not always consistent. And that goes into, again, ultimately you have to decide.
Okay, my final topic, I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to move on. You appear to accept that paragraphs 528 to 529 of your statement, that in the early stages of the pandemic, the PPE that was needed by the care sector in particular wasn't made available to it. The main reasons why, I'd like to explore, please, the reasons why sufficient PPE wasn't made available. And you've already discussed with Mr. Paul the adequacy of the PPE stockpile. But I'd like to ask you about two particular other factors. Firstly, supply chain problems. And with the care sector, routing PPE from the government to local authorities, which then had to be distributed to the care homes. Do you consider that sort of decentralised nature of the supply chain caused problems in PPE being made available?
So there are, the two things are important. So there's both how you get adequate volumes of PPE into the country, because internationally supply chains were stretched, were often just-in-time orders, and that collapsed rapidly around us. So we had this big challenge of getting adequate PPE for the health service, and then the social care supply chains, because often individual homes or groups of homes would have their own supply chains, and some local authorities would procure PPE, and they all collapsed. They didn't have the purchasing power to get into what was an ultra-competitive market, and we're not going to go into everything about PPE purchasing, but so actually the NHS was able in Wales, with some very difficult times, to get PPE to meet the NHS's needs. What we also did, though, because we could see social care supply lines were collapsing around it, there was pressure both from the individual groups, so Care Forum Wales, the biggest one, representing individual homes, as well as local authorities, to say the NHS needs to help us to get PPE, because the NHS had never supplied social care with PPE in that way. But we did it because it was an essential part of what we needed to do in the pandemic. And it was then that's your second point about how do you make sure it gets to people. And the NHS couldn't deal with a system where individual homes would come to the NHS and say, I want this much. So actually that's why we used the joint equipment stores that local authorities had, where the NHS, through our shared services organisation, would push out the PPE that we had, and then local authorities, who in the largest part commissioned care from those homes, would then be able to distribute that direct to homes. And I think that's still the right way to have run it. So we introduced a wholly new way of supplying social care with PPE because of the pandemic. And after a very difficult first month or so, it was actually, I think, really quite successful.
Okay. And the other factor that I'd like to focus on then in terms of supply of PPE, it arises from an email. Could you have up on screen, please, INQ 000 349 300? And could you go down to the last email, please, which is between pages 3 and 4? Hopefully you will see this on your screen there. Thank you, that's perfect. So this is an email from you on the 3rd of April 2020. And over onto page 4, 3 to 4, it refers to PPE. And then at the bottom of that top paragraph, it notes on page 4, it notes council leaders are concerned, as expected, that care workers are not being prioritised compared to the NHS. I'll read you all of the emails out of fairness before I ask you the question. Could you go up the page, please, to page 2 to 3? This is an email from Chris Jones on the 3rd of April. And he refers in paragraph 2 to some reasons why it may be that the NHS is being prioritised. And then the final part of the picture is on page 1. There's an email in response to that by a special advisor who's just referred to as Andy there. Which I think is passed on to you, where he says, I simply don't think that we can hold the line on social care as crudely depicted in the outline below. Given the way that COVID roared through residential homes in Italy or Spain, the idea that they are or can be made somehow secure places is clearly contestable. And he gives a number of reasons there as to what the staff do, cleaning, bathing, dressing, and so on, the residents, as to why they need to be fully equipped. The question really is this: was the NHS prioritised over care homes in the terms of PPE distribution?
So the PPE that was available was PPE that had been procured by the NHS for the NHS. You then have the pandemic, and as I said, the supply lines collapse. And so that's a problem for the NHS, and it's an even bigger problem for social care, because it isn't just they've got restricted supplies, they don't appear to have any. And so we directly supplied social care through the NHS, which had never been done before, and it wasn't done in England until sometime later. So actually you're using your purchasing power through the NHS to actually help to supply PPE to social care that wouldn't have it otherwise. And then it's around the guidance, and this is about the guidance that a number of people looked at about which group of workers need to have PPE and in what form. And so this is around not saying everyone in social care needs the same, because some people need different PPE. You've got cooks in social care, as well as people providing, as the note says, some people are providing personal care tasks. So actually that's then about working through which people are in an equivalent position and how to make sure that both the guidance reflects that and that you then supply it against those needs. And this is part of having to do something that we hadn't done before and needing to work through to make sure that guidance is reflective of the real world, and you then get the supplies to the homes that need it. And COVID in care homes was about much more than PPE. COVID circulating in the community was I understand from the evidence I've read, including documents in the inquiry, that it's community circulation that's the biggest factor. So even without PPE, that's still one of your biggest challenges about how you prevent it. But making sure there's PPE is important both for residents and for staff as well.
I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Straw. Mr. Gardner, I think you had some questions to the Children's Commissioner.
Minister, I'll take you back to the beginning of your evidence today, really. In your statement at paragraph 161, you make reference to a SAGE meeting of the 14th of February 2020. And then you make reference to the Chief Scientific Advisor for Health advising that school closures were being expressly discussed at that meeting. Do you recall that?
Yes, school closures were a regular feature of conversations throughout the period of time about
and so
whether they could or should.
May I ask then, that conversation post 14th of February, was that the first time you became aware that schools closing was either under consideration or maybe required?
I can't remember if it was then or a previous Cobra meeting, but it's part of what's envisaged in the pandemic flu plan. So I was aware that schools activity is one of the things you might consider because, of course, influenza, young children in particular, are one of the most vulnerable groups. So it's about protecting them from very direct harm.
Well, let's jump forward a month then. So then on the 18th of March 2020, the decision's taken to close schools as of the 20th of March 2020. So given that the Welsh Government would have been actively aware that there's at least the possibility of school closures on that time and at least a month prior to closure, can you say why the Children's Commissioner for Wales was not involved in the discussions around closure?
No, I can't tell you that. I have a wide range of responsibilities as the Health Minister through the pandemic, but I can't tell you how the lead contact was dealt with the Children's Commissioner and school closures as an issue. And actually, this is really a feature of the fact that we're trying to keep schools open and schools are closing around us. As I explained earlier, because a combination of staff who are isolating because they got symptoms and indeed because parents are withdrawing their children. And that is a rational response that concerned parents were making.
Well, given then that we have our month of knowledge and we also have your evidence there that you knew that these measures were likely to need to be taken, can you then answer why no children's rights impact assessment was undertaken at that time either?
I think we've been through this both in the document and I don't know if it's in my evidence or the Education Minister's statement. And the pace at which events were moving and the opportunity to undertake a children's right impact assessment. And again, in normal times, you would undertake that assessment before making the decision. But these were anything but normal times.
So in which case, as there was no involvement of the Children's Commissioner, as there was no children's right impact assessment, can you inform the inquiry how the Welsh Government would go about considering the rights of children, how to mitigate the impact of school closures if they're not thinking through those things at the time?
So we're thinking through keeping schools open for a whole variety of reasons because the evidence appears to be that children, particularly young children, are less affected. So that's why we're trying to keep schools open. It's the conversation that the First Minister, the Education Minister, and indeed local government have, and yet schools are closing around us. To then understand how you undertake a children's right impact assessment when actually you're forced from a decision on the 16th, 17th, you want to keep schools open, then you either close them or they will close for you. And so that's why the choice was made. And there isn't practically the time to undertake the full children's right impact assessment. And that's just the truth of it. You then get into how do you protect children's rights? And that's about wanting to have distance learning implemented from a standing start. And I should say, not just staff across every area of public service, the NHS and others who did so much to keep us well, but head teachers in the primary sector in particular, they went to extraordinary lengths to try to make sure that our more vulnerable learners could still have access to some form of learning. And all of this happened within a matter of days.
You may have missed the second part of my question, which was how did the Welsh Government think about mitigating the impact of closing schools if it's not considering it at the time?
And that is the point about distance learning. How do you move to successful distance learning? What does that look like for teenagers, people in secondary school? What does it look like for our youngest children? Actually, our youngest children in primary school, they're very different cohorts. You know, so young children at the age my son was at the time have an entirely different view about what learning looks like to, say, a child who's 10. So actually, you've got to think about what does distance learning look like? How can you protect those children? And they're missing all of that social interaction. It's why it was such a painful and difficult choice and why we spent so much of our capital in trying to get schools reopened in summer 2020 and why we had all those difficult conversations of whether we really needed to close schools and why me talking to the Education Minister in December 2020 saying I think you need to move to distance learning is actually the last shot before lockdown.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. I think that completes the questioning for today.
It does, my lady.
Mr. Gethin, I do understand the burdens the inquiry makes on serving ministers in particular when we ask them to help the inquiry, and I know I've now asked you to give evidence twice, so I hope this may be the last time, but I can't yet give you a guarantee. But anyway, thank you for the help you've given, and sorry it's been such a long day.
That's okay, it's important. Thank you.
Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
All rise.